The mystery behind Zoro's scarred eye was planned from the very beginning. Oda even told his mentor Nobuhiro Watsuki about it shortly after One Piece began serialization. However, in a 2021 interview, Watsuki admitted that he didn't know the reason and asked Oda why Zoro became one-eyed. To which Oda replied, nothing. He didn't reply at all, and he decided to save that surprise for another day. But Zoro's scar has been planned since day one. Now here's 55 other things that you probably didn't know about Zoro. His overall design along with Luffy and Nami were locked in very early on by Oda, and Zoro himself was used as the template for the protagonist Ryuma in Oda's one-shot manga named Monsters. The crazy thing here is that Monsters is actually part of the One Piece canon, thus I suppose making it chapter 0, or because a chapter 0 already exists, a chapter -1. With Zoro himself being a descendant of Ryuma, and his final attack against King during Wano is a direct reference to Ryuma slaying the dragon in Monsters. Zoro's heritage is it's a little bit tricky though, but what's even more confusing is his sword heritage. Zoro inherited the Wado Ichimonji, which was made by Shimotsuki Kozaburo, who also crafted Enma, a blade which Zoro also ended up with. However, he had to trade Shusui to get it, which was the sword used by his ancestor Ryuma. In total, Zoro has used 12 blades across the course of One Piece, with the most devastating by far being Hana Arashi, the improvised Usopp fusion sword, which is literally named Nose Storm. And you know, funnily enough, Zoro may have named this creation after his own father, because his name is Roronoa Arashi, a man who tragically died fighting against pirates and perhaps contributed to Zoro's early series hatred of pirates. We also know Zoro's grandfather, who is called Roronoa Pin Zoro, which is something you may never find out if you're an anime-only watcher, because they don't tend to adapt information like this. In fact, what they tend to do is tell you outright lies. Zoro's past in the anime is shockingly different from the manga, as he is portrayed as an orphan traveling from village to village defeating various dojos. However, the truth is that Zoro was born in Shimotsuki Village and is related to both Kuina and Koshiro. I'll never understand why they did that, but it's far from Zoro's worst treatment in the anime. During the Straw Hat separation segment, they also quote-unquote expanded on his time with Perona, who proceeded to attempt to transform Zoro into her servant and even dressed him up as her beloved bear Kumashi. The anime does some weird things to Zoro, but other anime series treat him far better. For example, in chapter 373 of volleyball sensation Haikyuu, Hinata reveals that Zoro is his favorite One Piece character. Now, funnily enough, Haikyuu is also translated by Viz, who handles the One Piece translation. So to keep consistency between the series, Hinata actually says that his favorite character is Zolo. Zolo probably being the greatest sore spot that fans have in regards to the official translation, although it came about due to such a weird situation. When Viz first started translating One Piece, they actually used the name Zoro. However, when 4Kids picked up the anime series, they changed his name to Zolo to preemptively avoid any potential copyright problems with the Zoro character created by Johnston McCulley. 4Kids then bombed and went under. One Piece was picked up by Funimation and they changed his name back to Zoro. However, this time Viz did not follow suit, and to this day, they still use Zolo. Unfortunate, but hey, who cares what his name is because he is a murderer. Before joining Luffy, Zoro had quite a dark past, including killing the original Mr. 7 of Baroque Works. Not defeating, not knocking unconscious, just like outright slice killing. Now, Mr. 7 allegedly used force against Zoro. However, so has pretty much every other Zoro opponent since the series began who did not die, which is all of them. But Zoro has been known to commit other crimes as well. On Wano, he was caught stealing Kinemon's Foxfire sword technique, and when Luffy questioned him about this, Zoro simply replied, "It's mine now." To be fair, he is a pirate. Stealing and killing are hardly out of character for a pirate. And Zoro is by far the most stereotypical pirate within the Straw Hats, also indulging in heavy drinking. In fact, it's such an addiction that Mihawk had to forbid it during Zoro's training on Kurogane Island. He said, "Now Zoro, no drinking until you've done the thing." And then hilariously, Mihawk took a sip of wine because he'd already done the thing. He was allowed to drink. And Zoro's excessive alcoholism likely doesn't help his sense of direction. We all know there's an ongoing joke about Zoro losing his way. Haha, he always gets lost. But he also actively fights against the very concept of direction as well. Specifically when it comes to Southbirds. Zoro has a very, very poor relationship with them because they always know where they're going and he doesn't. Although hilariously, the canonical reason why Zoro left Shimotsuki Village is simply because he couldn't find his way back home. He just got lost one day and was all like, "Welp, better hunt down that world's greatest sword guy," later going on to meet Johnny and Yosaku. However, their origin story was never told in the manga. Thankfully though, we have the anime to fill these gaps. During a filler episode, Zoro encountered a bandit called Dick, which led to my favorite bounty reveal in the entire series, as it simply states, "Wanted, Dick." I mean, it reads less like a bounty and more like a grinder profile, and it leads to some very awkward online episode summaries. For example, to his surprise, Dick's finishing blow is ruined by Zoro. So I guess we can add that to the ongoing list of Zoro crimes. Fun fact though, this is not the only time that Zoro has defeated a Dick, because the Portuguese word for Dick is pica, and Zoro has also defeated one of those. Speaking of names, did you know that in a quarter of a century of publication, Zoro has never once said Sanji's name? In fact, in the SBS of Volume 73, a very dedicated fan made a list of every name Zoro has ever used for Sanji, with the top 3 being Cook, You, and Bastard sitting up there at number 1. But there were also a bunch of one-off names that Zoro have used, including Clumsy Cook, Stupid Eyebrows, Amazing Eyebrows, Swirly Swirly, Mr. Nosebleed, and just plain old idiot. The Zoro-Sanji rivalry has been going on for so long that many people forget how it even began. It's a common misconception that it started on Little Garden with their whole hunting contest, but it actually began much earlier. Whilst tension existed during Baratie, the first sign of true animosity was during Arlong Park, where Zoro called Nami a quote small fry, and Sanji interpreted that as Zoro stating that Nami's breasts were small, which Sanji then took great offense to, and that's how the first fight between Zoro and Sanji began, over Nami's chest. And just like Nami's chest, that rivalry would only continue to grow as the series continued. Although the Viz manga decided to make this more family friendly, removing any words relating to biological chest sacs, and instead having Zoro call Nami a witch woman. Eiichiro Oda has never shied away from breast discussion though, not even when it comes to his male characters. Oda has officially revealed to us that Zoro's bust size clocks in at 110 centimeters, which means that canonically his boobs are actually bigger than either Nami or Robin's. Oda even went a step further and once drew a female Zoro who does not use three-sword style due to fears of chipping a tooth. Now look, there is one thing that Zoro does agree with Sanji on, and that is the issue of eating ice, because according to Oda, neither of them eat ice. However, objection! Because in chapter 701, Zoro is clearly seen drinking a drink and then proceeding to eat the ice, with the accompanying crunch sound effects. Now in response to this damning evidence, Oda actually claims that this was not Zoro. This was an imposter disguised as Zoro, which during early Dressrosa means that this was someone disguised as Zoro who was himself currently in a disguise. One of his better disguises, mind you, because Zoro is not a subtle man, and when trying to blend in, he often ends up generating more attention, such as when he went full furry in the cat costume on Dressrosa, or his rather sad attempt at becoming a penguin in movie 3. It tends to be much more successful when other people disguise themselves as Zoro, such as when Homer Simpson dressed as post-time skip Zoro in a Treehouse of Horror episode, presenting us with a very bleak view of Zoro's future. In a weird way, as The Simpsons often does, it did predict the future pretty disturbingly accurately, because long after that episode aired, Oda created the bad timeline characters, where at age 40, which is 1 year older than Homer Simpson, Zoro appears as an obese, balding man. To counter this, we do also have the good timeline, where honestly, nothing particularly changes. It's just Zoro with more wrinkles, and by age 40, he has allegedly mastered four-sword style, the logistics of which leave us with only one option for use. Even before appearing on The Simpsons, Zoro was quite famous though. So much so that Bartolomeo asked him for an autograph, where instead of writing his name, Zoro simply wrote the kanji for sword. However, this signature was actually created by Zoro's voice actor, Kazuya Nakai, who within One Piece also plays Soul Death, the wacky horse Pierre, and most hilariously of all, Drip, who is the fake Sanji. Meanwhile, Zoro's fake Straw Hat equivalent is named Manjiro, and he actually has access to an ability that Zoro does not, which is that Manjiro is immune from getting lost. Primarily because he is so obese and unfit that he rarely has the energy to move at all, and when he does, he gets tired very quickly. Zoro himself also gets tired very quickly, just for other reasons. According to Oda, Zoro goes to sleep at 4 AM and wakes up at 7 AM, which mimics Oda's alleged sleep schedule, as he claims to only sleep for 3 hours a day. But that's why Zoro is always falling asleep, because he doesn't actually do a whole lot of sleeping when it's the time it is that he's meant to. Now this has gone on to affect Zoro's mental abilities, but in a very envious way, because you see, Zoro has selective memory, like literally selective memory. He actually has the ability to erase things that he does not wish to remember. This was seen in chapter 491 when Zoro met Kami, and then decided to erase the memory of Kokoro, and thus make Kami the first mermaid he's ever met. However, the fan base does not forget. They remember a lot, and as a result, a subculture has developed surrounding a curious pattern in Zoro's fights. You may or may not have noticed this, but a suspicious amount of Zoro's opponents have been either dark-skinned or in-world minorities, which has led to the online epithet of Minority Hunter Zoro. Now, speaking of race, Oda has stated that Zoro Zoro would finish in 5th place if all of the Straw Hats ran a 50-meter race. But this is primarily because Zoro would waste a lot of time getting lost on the track. Because Zoro is often the odd one out, and his membership to the Worst Generation Club is no exception. After Killer's Smile Fruit incident, Zoro is the only member of the Worst Generation who is not a Devil Fruit user. Now, thankfully, Blackbeard kind of picks up the slack there by having 2 Devil Fruits, which means that we have 12 Worst Generation members and 12 Devil Fruits between them. Nice and balanced. Unlike Zoro's win-loss ratio, which is the highest of the combat-geared Straw Hats. His most troublesome opponents being Dracule Mihawk on Baratier and Chimney on Water 7. Not the child Chimney, but the literal chimney that he got thrown into. Which is something that Zoro really should have seen coming because he had already used Observation Haki by then. In fact, Zoro is the first Straw Hat to use any brand of Haki, using a mix of Observation and Armament Haki to bring down Mr. 1 on Alabasta. This was something retroactively confirmed on Wano, but it's still insane to think that Zoro used Advanced Armament before he learned Basic Armament. But it's a thing that happened. But being the first crew Haki user is great because first isn't something that Zoro sees a lot of elsewhere, particularly in popularity polls where he hangs out a lot in 2nd place. Luffy is always number 1, of course. However, on one occasion, Zoro's 2nd place was even usurped by bread-hating polar bear-having Trafalgar Law. And in the World Top 100 poll, my home region of Oceania voted Zoro in 5th place, putting Nami, Robin, Yamato, and Carrot above everyone else, thus revealing a clear bit of bias in this region. And I mean, look, to be fair, it is so damn hot in Australia, so of course we're thirsty as crap. Zoro remains well lubricated, however, and has even lent his voice to 12 different musical tracks across One Piece history, usually singing with the other crew members, but he also has 2 solo songs being Eyes of Zoro and Spirit of Zoro respectively. The concept of spirit is interesting because Zoro is very much an apathist in his approach to life. In fact, I'd even go a step further and say that Zoro is deliberately antagonistic towards the concept of gods, directly challenging Enel's assertions and even claiming that he will become the king of hell. You know, looking back on it, Zoro was also hung on a cross in Shell's Town, so there's a lot of religious irony with his character. But also his attack set is firmly rooted in religion, specifically Buddhism and Hinduism, the latter of which is more evident with Ashura. Other than religion though, most of Zoro's attack names come from sushi. And the reason for this, according to a discussion between Oda and a fan, is because Zoro has probably never tried sushi and has some weird mental fascination with it, almost naming his attacks arbitrarily because he thinks the words are cool. However, something that is very not cool is Zoro's bathing schedule. Along with Luffy and Brook, Zoro bathes once a week, which is, well, look, it's not enough. Absolutely not enough for a man who sweats and bleeds as much as he does. Despite this information, a fan has also asked what Zoro smells like. And much to my surprise, the answer was steel, as opposed to the more realistic putrid pile of rotting meat. I imagine it's so bad that people just fall down in his presence, mistaking it for Conqueror's Haki. But Zoro himself is often mistaken as the captain of the Straw Hats, primarily due to the seriousness he exudes, often leading other people to believe that Luffy is an even more ruthless demonic monster to have someone like Zoro under his command. And you know, it's so bad that sometimes even Oda forgets that Zoro is not Luffy, such as the initial printing of chapter 698, where Zoro was drawn with Luffy's trademark chest scar. Oh, and just about that scar, so many people commented on the Luffy Facts video that they thought Luffy got his scar from Zoro, because there's a fight scene in episode 223 where Zoro does slice Luffy's chest in the X shape. However, this is a non-canon filler episode which never happened in the manga, but it has since given the impression to a shocking amount of people that Zoro is the one responsible for Luffy's scar. To be fair, sometimes the One Piece movies even mistake Zoro for Luffy as well, as Zoro is the only character other than Luffy and maybe arguably Uta as well, who has been the protagonist of a film. In this case, it was movie 5, The Cursed Holy Sword, where we learn all about Zoro's childhood friend Saga, who has been corrupted by a magical sword, and also there's magical orbs, and also it's a bad movie. It's a really bad movie. One of, if not the worst, One Piece movies. Swords magically coming to life aren't all that weird in the series though. In fact, Oda has anthropomorphized 3 of Zoro's swords, which revealed to us that the blades resemble their creators. But it doesn't stop there. All 3 of Zoro's earrings have names and personalities, collectively referred to as the Pierce Triplet Sisters, and his Haramaki has a seductive persona named Haramakiko. Such artfully crafted objects, and Zoro is a popular target for art, specifically street art, with a whole range of amazing Zoro tributes being placed throughout the world, with my favorite one being from Kalama, Chile. Zoro has transcended Page and become part of popular culture at large, which is only reinforced by the fact that he is the only Straw Hat to have canonically fought against Batman. Granted, it was this Batman, but and that's still pretty cool. And if you're an anime watcher, Luffy also fought Batman, and Batman, to his credit, held his own pretty damn well. In the anime, Batman can use armament haki so powerful that he blocked Luffy, and by all rights, Batman should be the one fighting Kaido right now instead of Luffy. Meanwhile, instead of Shellstown, Luffy was supposed to encounter Zoro as part of Buggy's crew in Orangetown. They were supposed to be something of a villainous family unit, not biologically, but more like a Yakuza-style arrangement. And look, that never happened, but Zoro did keep his cold and sometimes quite antagonistic attitude. A great example of which are his interactions surrounding Vivi, as he is by far the Straw Hat with the most neutral attitude towards her. It's like he has something against her that he refuses to say out loud. He's also the only one who didn't try to see her naked during the bath scene in Alabasta. I mean, even Cobra tried, and he's her dad. Sorry, he was her dad. He's dead now. But look, when does a man die? It's when he's forgotten. And Zoro will never be forgotten, primarily because he has a life-size golden statue in Oda's hometown of Kumamoto. And for the unveiling ceremony, the Kumamoto town mascot even cosplayed Zoro, which is pretty impressive. Admittedly, I cannot beat that. But I do have a close second, because I also have a life-size Zoro statue looking perpetually upset in my office. And that's 56 things that you may or may not have known about Zoro. Gear Fit Zoro is confirmed. Eiichiro Oda himself has constructed a world where Zoro ate the Gomu Gomu no Mi and is therefore that universe's most legendary of Joy Boys. But it doesn't stop there, because this is Roronoa Zoro. So is this, and you. Wait, not you. Get out of here. But you're definitely Zoro. In fact, Zoro has gotten himself so lost in the multiverse that there are over 20 of them, all meandering about in alternate universes. Such as the universe where Zoro is a mafia boss seeking dominance for the Zoroaster family, all the way to the more wacky ones, where Zoro takes on the role of Snow White and even requires his true love to save him from the spell of the evil Queen Nami. The One Piece multiverse is criminally underexplored, not just by Oda, who created these alternate worlds himself, but by the fans who seem so laser focused on only having one Zoro. And that would of course be our Prime Universe Zoro. He's the center of everything and acts, ironically, as a sort of compass that guides the rest of the Zoros, which probably explains why they all became such shit shows. You already know plenty about Prime Zoro, but he is not the first Zoro. In fact, our first layer of primary universes contain a fair few Zoros that predate the one we know. And from here things get pretty immediately complicated. Because prior to One Piece, Eiichiro Oda created a series of one-shots, all compiled in a volume called Wanted, which includes Romance Dawn, the chapter that laid the foundation for One Piece. But there were 4 other one-shots in Wanted, one of which was called Monsters. And many people think that the protagonist of Monsters, Ryuma, is the prototype Zoro. And that's because they look exactly alike, and I don't blame anyone for thinking that way. But the truth is that Monsters is actually part of the Prime Universe. This is a canon event that happened in One Piece hundreds of years in the past, during the life of the legendary Wano samurai Ryuma. So no, he's technically not the first Zoro. That title belongs to this guy. In another one-shot called God's Gift for the Future, the main character of Bran looks pretty remarkably like Zoro, especially on the cover of Wanted, although his personality is more akin to Nami. That's not all though, because in another of Oda's one-shots named Ikiyako, we have another prototype Zoro in the form of the main protagonist Guko, a monk whose religious motifs Zoro would go on to inherit in One Piece. And that's not all he'd inherit, because another of the prime level Zoros exist in the Boss Luffy universe, a series of anime tales set in 19th century Japan. And not only is Zoro a Buddhist monk just like Guko, but he also wears Guko's outfit from Ikiyako. So we've got some multiversal overlapping here. But one fun thing about the Boss Luffy specials is that at one point Zoro ends up joining Buggy, which is a direct reference to Oda's original plan to have Zoro be a part of Buggy's crew. But here's something that just made my mind go bleh. Guko, the prototype Zoro, may also be a Prime Universe character. This is because in Monsters, which again takes place in the One Piece world, there's a panel where you just flat out see Guko in the foreground. And we're not talking about vague similarities here. He has the same scar and everything. So in conclusion, the Prime Universe has many Zoros, perhaps too many Zoros. So many that when you look at the cover of Wanted, you can pretty much just see Zoro 3 times over, with Ryuma, Bran, and Guko. The Prime Zoro also has alternate timeline variants. In Zoro's perfect universe, all he does is continue to train in the art of the sword, until at age 40 he can use 4 swords, and by age 60 he started to refer to himself as 5 sword style Zoro, which has also led to the infamous fan art speculating as to exactly where Zoro is wielding his extra blades. Look, let's be real about this. Eventually, one of them's going in the butt. I don't know if it's 4 4-sword, 5-sword, or when he graduates to 6-sword, but eventually he's just gonna run out of places. Although in Zoro's worst possible timeline, he loses most of his teeth due to always wielding a sword in his mouth, and by age 60, he's a withered old man who will bow to anyone willing to give him some spare change, which is a stark contrast to how much it took Zoro to bow before Mihawk in the Prime universe. Our basic off-the-shelf model of Zoro also appears in the Dragon Ball Fusion universe called Cross Epoch. In this world, Zoro and Piccolo form a duo of outcasts, each of them riding what looks like a reindeer version of the Manticores who only spoke in underwear from Impel down. It's also fun to point out that Zoro's outfit has the Kozuki symbol on it 6 years before we even met Kinemon, and what I like about this is that Zoro and Piccolo fight as a team, meaning that together they form a 4-sword style duo. But with that, we are done with the basic Zoros, and from here things are gonna go pretty off the rails, because we're expanding one layer out to the secondary universes, which take the basic template of Zoro and heavily distort him, such as Gomu Gomu Zoro, who was brought into existence when Oda made a series of what-if scenarios for One Piece magazine, and one of the greatest was what if Zoro ate the Gomu Gomu no Mi, resulting in this terrifying image of 3-sword Zoro with Luffy's abilities, which is a manga series that I would 100% read. Zoro with Luffy's powers on a mission to become the king of the swords, and this is also far from the only universe where Zoro takes charge. In the Family Time world, we have Zorohe, the patriarch of the Straw Hats who are now all biologically related, and Zorohe is described as the dad who hates having a family. However, deep down, we all know that Zorohe loves his family, as seen when his son Furaichiro got into some trouble with a gang, and Zorohe came to his rescue. Also in this reality, Zoro is either the son of Robin or Brook, who serve as the grandparents. But no matter what the universe is, Zoro has a nasty habit of getting into fights. In the No Honor Time mafia-themed realm, Don Zorosia is head of one of the 3 great mafia families, with both he and Don Lufione agreeing that Don Sanjino has no right to lead because he doesn't have a combed-back hairstyle. This leads to an argument where Don Zorosia declares war, however he is ultimately betrayed by his agent Robita and killed. And this is the most confusing universe because it doesn't actually exist. Like even more than fictional comics already don't actually exist. Because all of these events take place in the dream of a Moe statue in the real world. So thankfully the Report Time universe is slightly more grounded. This is basically Zoro but in a chibi One Piece world, with a reporter interviewing the Straw Hats early on, like a sort of community news story. And the reporter initially describes Zoro as a quote octo-bastard before being won over by his sheer manliness. And Zoro goes on to prove that manliness knows no gender, when he becomes a little old lady with a perm in the Obahan Time world. Zoroyama spends her days cooking, in this case sushi. However, whilst cooking, Zoroyama accidentally sliced up her entire kitchen. And I believe that Zoroyama was able to cut everything with the exception of the fish. I should say it's very hard to separate Zoro from swords in any universe, especially Zoromichi in the Class 3C Time world, a classic delinquent school student who insists on carrying 3 swords to class, and is specifically told off by the in-universe ace who is one of the teachers. Although next to that in the One Piece school world, Zoro also carries 3 swords, but he's allowed to in this universe because he's a member of the Swordsmanship Club, with Zoro ultimately becoming friends with fellow student Luffy after Foxy vows to forcibly become president of every club, including the Swordsmanship Club. You'd think that Luffy and Zoro become friends in most worlds, but that's definitely not the case. In the Ed Sullivan Show universe, Zorosaku is a poor peasant farmer living under the rule of Gomukawa Luffy-nobi, and after the town champion Usokawa Goemon is captured, Zoro leads a rebellion against the Gomukawa shogunate in order to free him. But there are worlds where Luffy and Zoro become more subtle enemies as well. And in 19th century England, we discover Nakamura Hanzoro, who becomes a suspect in a murder being investigated by the great detective Looms, primarily because Nakamura Hanzoro admits to enjoying slicing up people in the street, but he does specify that he didn't kill this particular person. And he's right, because as it turns out, Nakamura Hanzoro was not the culprit. Interestingly, this Zoro is based on the real-life person Nakamura Hanjiro, which is historically accurate because he would have lived in the same time as Sherlock Holmes, which actually makes it not historically accurate because Sherlock Holmes is fictional. But it's time to abandon any sense of reason, because expanding a step further takes us into the danger that is the tertiary universes, where Zoro starts to become completely unrecognizable. And here I'd like to start with the story of Zoro White, a rare alternate universe where Zoro is the main character. Zoro White is an allegedly gorgeous but misfortunate princess, loved by all animals. However, she is treated terribly by her evil stepmother, Queen Nami, who despises Zoro White because she's prettier. Zoro, that is, not Nami. Although everyone else in the universe seems to disagree on that. It's just the mirror that calls Zoro White prettier. Everyone else is like, but Queen Nami decides to act, implementing poison apples. But all 3 of them were eaten by Lubu, Chobu, and Robu. However, Zoro White, for some reason, decides to eat all 3 remaining apple cores and falls under Queen Nami's spell anyway. So now Zoro White's only hope is for her Prince Charming to come along and break the spell, which he does. Prince Robbie pre-arrives to wake Zoro White up, but immediately decides that she is completely unlovable. So Brobu and the other 2 little pigs promptly bury her, and that is the surprisingly dark story of Zoro White. Remembering that fairy tales do have very dark origins. Meanwhile, in the superhero Chopperman universe, we find Zorogila, one of the 3 great Usodabadan villains. So fun fact, in the original Omake, his name is Zorogila, but then in the actual Chopperman manga series, his name is changed to Zorokiller, thus making him the Onigiri Mystery Man Zorokiller, which is a reference to his onigiri attack. And in world, Zoro demands onigiri at all times with deadly consequences if you don't have any for him. Also, the 4 ones across his chest are a reference to his birthday, the 11th of November or 11/11, which is now also a reference in the Prime universe with Zoro's bounty of 1,111,000,000 berries. And look, is it weird that Zoro being made out of literal onigiri isn't anywhere near the weirdest of the Zoros? I would say that accolade probably goes to Zorodadana from Space Time, one of the wildest alternate universes, with Zorodadana being a swordsman of darkness from the planet Venus. He's also one of 2 leaders of the Universal Association of Darkness, a position that he shares with San Vader. So this is one of the extremely rare universes where Zoro and Sanji just naturally work together without Luffy. In fact, they work together in spite of Luffy, because their plan is to invade the moon. However, it is foiled by Mugiwara Man, who accidentally destroys the moon before they get an opportunity to invade it. Another universe where Zoro and Luffy are enemies. I find those worlds particularly interesting. However, in the Circus Time universe, they share a more typical friendship, with Zobe and Lugao being held captive in Usoglia's circus. And Zobe's special trick is that he rides a teeny tiny bicycle. Zobe often plots with Lugao to rebel and escape the circus for freedom, although they are often manipulated by Beast Tamer Namo into performing regardless. Assumedly, Zobe is free now because Lugao did go on to become the Circus King, which is also the only universe to date where Luffy has actually achieved his dream, something I forgot to mention in the Luffy multiverse video. But Zoro and Luffy are once again allies in the RPG Time universe, as both are part of a party led by Usopp with the mission of defeating the evil Demon King Brook. Zoro's class is Warrior, assumedly chosen because it gets the biggest of the weapons. However, he later decides to switch to the Hero class when Luffy and Usopp have an argument, meaning that the party now has 3 heroes. Not that it matters because this argument takes up all of their playtime. And speaking of all of the time, mate, this video, it's gone on for a while, hasn't it? And I imagine that you're craving a nice glass of milk. Well, crave no more because here you are. A fresh glass of milk from this cow. Zoro Milk is his name, and he's an angry minotaur from the Monster Time world who constantly berates Hanzara for being a pervert. It's also noted and purposeful that Zoro looks more like a basic Holstein cow than he does a minotaur, which is that this is the first minotaur to be depicted by Oda, which would go on to be referenced in One Piece itself, as during the Impel Down arc, Minotaurus retained Zoro Milk's basic cow aesthetic. But even a cow cannot prepare us for this next step, as we're expanding into the Beyond universes. Terrifying uncharted territory which expands beyond the basic mediums of anime, manga, and logic, such as the woodblock print universe, with this Zoro from the One Piece Art Noue exhibition, a series of prints that tell the story of an alternate universe Wano. The Straw Hats land, split up, and Zoro spends most of the woodblock prints getting lost. But now for my favorite alternate Zoro, which is the Hungry Days Cup Noodle commercial world Zoro. I cannot overstate how much I love this universe, and it's because the world building is on the scale of, if not potentially greater than One Piece itself. Like, the amount they can do in such a short time is astounding. For example, we see that Zoro shares a class with Perona, Cavendish, Gecko Moria, Toshigi, and Rouge at least, and he's also a member of the Kendo Club, with Vista, Daz Bones, and Shiryu. But then Zoro becomes the star of the first Cup Noodle saga. He's in the Kendo Club and loses a prestigious contest to Dracul Mihawk. After losing, he then redoubles his effort to train and eventually collapses on the school roof, vowing to never lose again. Luffy happens to stumble upon him at this moment, thinks that it's really cool, and the two become friends. And Luffy is of course holding cup noodles at the time. And then we have live action Zoro, portrayed by Makenyu. And at the time of recording this video, the live action is not yet out, so there's not much I can tell you about this one yet. But that is every other multiverse Zoro explained. Zoro is not the first mate of the Straw Hat Pirates, or the vice captain, deputy director, co-chairman, or number 2 in the loo. Zoro is simply Zoro. And this is one of the biggest misconceptions in all of the One Piece. In canon material, Zoro has never, not once, been referred to as the first mate. And that's because Zoro's position in the crew was not intentional. It was the result of a series of pre-production incidents which pushed Eiichiro Oda's preferred vice captain out of the role, had a massive effect on the series as a whole, and completely changed how Oda viewed the structure of piracy. So what we should do first is we should actually define what a first mate is. To the uncultured swine, this might seem like a fairly straightforward discussion because Zoro, he was the first to join Luffy's crew and they're both very good friends, one even might say mates if you were particularly Australian. But the actual meaning of the first mate title has nothing to do with the order in which people join a crew. It signifies the individual with the most responsibility and authority behind the captain, which you may think was Zoro, but that was not the original plan. When Oda was still planning and sketching out One Piece, he had a fairly clear idea of what would eventually come to pass, which can be seen in the earlier known sketches of the Straw Hat crew, which not only includes the OG East Blue 5, but we also see prototypes of Smoking Chopper, Thin Frankie, Cowboy Brook, and a fishman that would evolve into a Jinbei. The only unplanned crew member was Nico Robin. But in addition to their designs, Oda had also quite clearly planned out each crew member's role. And what has always struck me as endlessly fascinating is that the prototype Usopp character was the vice captain and or first mate of the crew, which I think is why Usopp and Luffy have inherited one of the strongest dynamics within the Straw Hats. The two of them, they were instant best friends. So Zoro wasn't actually supposed to have as big of a role on the crew as he does in One Piece, not originally. In fact, I'd say he was probably intended to be around equal weighting with Sanji. And one of the reasons why I say that is because Oda also made a prototype manga called The Great Swordsman, about a rivalry between a samurai and a knight, which is the earliest known appearance of a prototype Sanji named Romeo, who was going to have a bitter rivalry with Ryuma, the character who inspired Zoro. So what changed? What ultimately elevated Zoro to that second-in-command position that we all assume he has? In theory, if Oda wanted to go with his original idea, then he probably would have had Luffy meet Usopp first, and that could very well have been the plan. But what changed is that during the prototype years, Oda briefly had the idea of turning One Piece into a dual protagonist series like The Great Swordsman, focusing on both Luffy and Zoro. The idea being that Oda was a bit nervous that Luffy was too goofy of a main character to carry the series on his shoulders alone. So for a while, Oda was very intent on introducing a more traditionally cool character as soon as possible to balance out Luffy's wackiness and add a bit more broad appeal to the early days of One Piece. Obviously, the dual protagonist idea never quite came to fruition, but that is why Luffy meets Zoro first, because Oda felt that the series needed that contrast as soon as possible. And so Zoro swooped in to take that second-in-command position away from Usopp. And at one stage, he was also going to take it away from Moji because there was also a point where Zoro was going to be a member of the Buggy Pirates, in what has been described as an elder brother role. So that's how all of that happened. And what we now have to deal with is the aftermath, which is the accidental placement of Zoro in a role that Oda didn't originally intend for him. And as a result, there isn't a single occasion in One Piece where Zoro is referred to as the first mate or the vice captain. There are certainly a lot of times where Zoro is mistaken by other characters as the captain because he is ever so powersome, but my personal speculation is that Oda has never labeled Zoro as the first mate or vice captain because in the early days he may still have been planning to give Usopp that role. However, as things progressed, Oda stopped seeing a need to define the first mate position. Before I continue, I would be remiss not to mention that there is a piece of official-ish media where Zoro is stated to be the first mate, and that would be the One Piece live action. In episode 5, Luffy's feeling a bit down after the Garp incident, and so Nami, Zoro, and Usopp agree that someone should have a talk with him, with Nami stating to Zoro, "You're his first mate." Kinda seems like that falls under your job description, which is a line that kind of annoys me. Not because they're defining Zoro as the first mate in this universe, that's cool, but because it's not consistent with the previous 4 episodes. Zoro begrudgingly accepts Nami's logic here and goes to have a very brief talk with Luffy, but he shouldn't have, because in the live action at this stage, he still hasn't actually joined the crew yet, let alone taken on a role. After Shellstown, Zoro and Nami were still insisting that they weren't a crew, and Zoro doesn't actually officially join until episode 6, so calling him the first mate here doesn't make any sense. What I think happened here is that the writer for episode 5 assumed that Zoro was going to join the crew after Shellstown, because that's how it happened in the manga. However, the writers of episodes 1 to 4 didn't do that at any stage, because they wanted to keep the whole not a crew gag going instead. And so what you end up with here is a fairly gaping plot hole. But the TLDR is that in the live action, yes, Zoro is the first mate, but it makes no sense. And in the manga, Zoro isn't the first mate, but also kind of is, thanks to a potentially confusing series of pre-production events. And this really hasn't become any clearer over time. These days, whenever the first mate question comes up, people are very quick to point their hand sausages at the color spread of chapter 1031. Very lovely piece of artwork featuring many familiar fan favorites. But hang on a second. Have you noticed the trend with all of these characters? Silver's Ray Lee, Ben Beckman, King Katakuri, and the rest? These are all of the characters who are either labeled as or assumed to be the right-hand men of their respective captains. Although in Katakuri's case, he's less of a first mate and takes on the role of an Asian firstborn, charged with the sacred duty of honoring his mother. Although he's not actually the firstborn child, that would be Charlotte Perospero, and he's busy luring children onto his candy escalator, which is the thing that actually happened. He told the children to, quote, lick his candy escalator. But here, Zoro is smack bang in the middle, and thus confirmed as the first mate / vice captain of the Straw Hats. Done deal. Video over, internet man. Like and subscribe. But there's just one big problem here, which is that Oda then went on to go out of his way to confirm that Zoro isn't the first mate as a result of this color spread. In the SBS of volume 102, a very excitable fictional pirate fan asks the following question. Hello, Adachi. Looking at the cover page of chapter 1031, it seems like Beppo is the number 2 of the Heart Pirates, right? I was surprised, because I thought that Penguin, Shachi, and Beppo were all tied for number 2. Are you saying that Beppo, with Sulong, is the strongest between them? And to this, Oda replies, that cover, huh? Similar to Zoro, not all of those characters have the title of first mate. I selected the number 2s as I saw fit. Usually Shachi and Penguin are more dependable, but those two who have seen Beppo Sulong form are no match for Beppo in terms of fighting power. I acknowledge him. So if anything, what we have here is a power scaling diagram and not a first mate vice captain diagram. And another interesting point is that Oda posts time lapses of the production process of all of his color spreads, and the idea of drawing all of these number 2s was a bit of an accident. If you look at the time lapse, the original idea was to draw all of the important swordsmen in One Piece, which at one stage included characters like Mihawk and Toshigi, but Oda abandoned that idea and used the leftover Zoro to spawn the eventual color spread. And really, it's just fascinating that Oda not only goes out of his way in series not to define Zoro as the first mate, but actively confirms that he doesn't have this title in extended media. And on top of that, and this is something that we rarely think about, Oda almost never uses the first mate or vice captain titles in One Piece in general. There are shockingly few characters in the series as a whole who have the title of first mate or vice captain. In fact, almost no pirate crews use those titles. I can only give you 8 characters who have been defined as such. And now, to be fair, one of them is Silver's Ray Lee, who was formally introduced as the first mate of the Roger Pirates, and another very prominent figure is Ben Beckman, who was labeled as the first mate of the Red Hair Pirates all the way back in the SBS of Volume 5. But beyond the original concepts of One Piece, the title usage here gets a bit more shaky. During East Blue, we encounter Moji and Django, both of whom were first mates of the Buggy and Black Cat Pirates respectively, and then we don't see a single other first mate again until Jaya, where we meet Big Knife Sarkis, first mate of the Bellamy Pirates, and a character who I don't think anyone even knows exists named Okame, who was given the title of first mate of the Hoka Hoka Pirates in the Grand Blue data file. That's an example of how far I have to dig to find first mates in the series. They are exceedingly rare, and I'll tell you why in a second, but our final canon first mates are Boo, who was said to be the first mate of the Harpo Navy that we met on Dressrosa, and Aladdin, who was the first mate of the Sun Pirates during Jinbei's captaincy, and is now assumedly the captain himself. But that's it. That's all I got for you. Out of over 1,000 characters in 27 years of fictional pirate storytelling, there are only 8 first mates and or vice captains. And I think a big reason for this is that very early on, Oda accidentally broke the pirate mold with his awkward Zoro situation, and it made him realizes that each pirate crew operates differently according to the values of their captain. This can be seen most prominently with the 4 emperors. Whitebeard doesn't have a first mate because the goal of his crew is to have and nurture a family. Whitebeard was a father who loved all of his sons equally, with the responsibility of a first mate being divided over his 16 division commanders. And Marco might be the first division commander, and he did inherit captaincy after Whitebeard's death, but the division numbers themselves do not dictate hierarchy. There's also no functional difference between the 1st Division and the 16th Division. They were all loved equally by Daddy Whitebeard. For a more dysfunctional family dynamic, you have the Big Mom Pirates, who also follow a non-traditional structure with the Sweet Commander system, which designated vice captain responsibility between 4 individuals. However, it also gets a bit complicated because the Big Mom Pirates follow a family hierarchy as well. We've mentioned him before in this video, but although he wasn't a Sweet Commander, Charlotte Perospero Sparrow, the firstborn, held more authority than Katakuri. The Charlotte family were a bit of a big mess. There was no clearly defined second in command. It really was just a system designed to placate their mother as best they could. Then with Kaido, you've got the Beast Pirates who value only strength, but again divide the first mate role across 3 calamities. Blackbeard then has his 10 Titanic captains. Cross Guild has probably the most, how shall we say, unique command structure in modern piracy. Doflamingo had his 4 card suit officers, and so on and so forth. The whole idea of having a first mate almost seems like an outdated relic of an idea in One Piece, which is why we only tend to encounter them in the old days of Roger and Silver's Rayleigh. In the modern day, we've evolved beyond that, and that is seen most clearly within the Straw Hats themselves. The Straw Hats are a crew focused on dreams and adventure, and so Luffy doesn't refer to people by their traditional roles aboard a pirate vessel, but instead by their ambitions. And a lot of the time these do cross over. Like Frankie's dream of wanting to build a ship that can sail around the world, it makes sense to call him the shipwright. But there are some where it doesn't make sense, and Zoro is one of them. His dream is to become the world's greatest swordsman. So to Luffy, he doesn't see Zoro as a first mate, he sees Zoro as a swordsman, which is incredibly respectful. He doesn't try to force Zoro into a traditional pirate structure. Instead, he sees Zoro's dream and actively supports it, creating a new role, as he does with each and every other crew member. When it comes to the issue of trust, I often say this with Luffy, but you either have it or you don't. There are no levels of trust. And so there's not really any need to designate a second in command either, because each Straw Hat has their moments where they fulfill that role. And as much as you can definitely say that Zoro often becomes the default second in command, there are so many situations where that role falls to Sanji. In fact, I think if you went through and tallied all the moments where they each take on that position, they'd probably be about equal. But each Straw Hat has at some point taken on that second in command position. And that is why this crew is particularly unbeatable. The Straw Hats are extremely modular and can function perfectly in any configuration, to the point where there's no need for a traditional hierarchy aside from the captain. Because putting people in cleanly defined boxes like first mate or vice captain is the antithesis of freedom. Luffy would never do such a thing, which is why Zoro has never been the first mate and will simply always be the swordsman of the Straw Hat Pirates. Oda just revealed Zoro's entire family tree going back to the days of the legendary samurai Ryuma. But he didn't stop there. We also have a massive revelation concerning a certain Tama, a controversial plot twist surrounding Chopper, and by the way, did you know the Pokemon canonically exists in the One Piece world? Sometimes these SBS segments are, let's be honest, a little bit shaky. It's mostly questions about man parts and more man parts. But this is so huge that it's actually caused a lot of controversy online in regards to why this information isn't in the actual series. So we've got a lot to talk about, and let's get into it. The first item on the old narrative agenda is the rather extensive Zoro family tree. Weirdly enough, Zoro has gone from the Straw Hat whose family we know least about to the one that we know the most about, even more than Sanji. We don't know who Sanji's grandparents are. But everything stems from a group of travelers who left Wano 55 years ago, including Shimotsuki Kozaburo, the man who made both Wado and Enma, as well as Shimotsuki Furiko, who was the older sister of Ushimaru, that Zoro lookalike who Yamato met as a child. Oh, and Minatomo was also there. He's the carpenter who appears in chapter 1, and someone who I guess is now like at least 55 years old, and that's if he left Wano as a baby. Altogether, there were 25 people who sailed away from Wano and towards East Blue, and this journey, it took quite a while to make. From the time they left Wano to founding Shimotsuki Village was 3 years. And even then, only 10 of the original 25 citizens stayed in Shimotsuki Village, meaning that there are 15 other Wano citizens who just went elsewhere, including Minatomo, I suppose, who ended up in Fuchsia Village. And Shimotsuki Village is actually a collaboration between the 10 Wano citizens and some existing villagers who were saved from mountain bandits. Old mate Kozaburo ended up mating with one of the village women, and together they produced a son, Koshiro. Koshiro then, during the course of his life, met an unknown and unnamed woman, and they went on to produce Kuina. That's one side of the family tree, but here is the much more interesting side. Shimotsuki Furiko, sister of Ushimaru, partnered up with a villager named Roronoa Pinzoro, who was a swordsman and is the grandfather of Zoro. Furiko and Pinzoro had a son which they named Roronoa Arashi, which means storm, indicating that he was a rather rowdy dude guy, and Arashi fell straight into a puddle of love with a bandit's daughter named Terra, with the two of them eventually intercoursing, which resulted in the one and only Roronoa Zoro. Unfortunately, as is often the case in One Piece, Zoro's parents were both victims of sad tragedy. Arashi died at a relatively young age after a battle against pirates, which may retrospectively contribute to why Zoro hated them, their pirates, so much at the beginning of the series. Meanwhile, his mother pulled a banshina and died of an illness, thus leaving Zoro quite thoroughly orphanized. From this, we have three conclusions. 1. Zoro and Kuina are related, although it's hard to tell exactly how because we don't know Kozaburo's relation to Furuko. Secondly, Zoro is indeed also related to Ushimaru, who is Zoro's great uncle. And thirdly, as a result, Zoro is indeed a descendant of Ryuma, and thus probably has more right to Shusui than he does to Enma. So the reason why this is controversial is because a lot of people weren't thrilled that this information was presented in an SBS as opposed to, say, the actual series. And my personal opinion is that, it's fine. Oda made it very clear that he doesn't consider Zoro's lineage all that important, and had outright stated that he probably wasn't going to include it in the manga. And the other thing is that Zoro himself doesn't care about his heritage. He's much more focused on the future of his dream and even achieving Luffy's dream. With someone like Sanji, exploring his family was very important because his character is one big struggle of identity. It's about Sanji coming to terms with who and what he is. But that's Sanji, and Sanji is not Zoro, and that's not what Zoro is. Zoro is who Zoro is, which is not that. He's not hyper-focused on, oh my god, I'm a Shimotsuki, what does that mean for me, Zoro, and my character? He doesn't care. And even if this was revealed in the manga, it would have led to a lot of complaining regardless. I mean, just the idea that Oda may have taken the time to introduce 6 new characters into the already bloated Wano, just to serve the purpose of telling us that Zoro is a distant relation to people of vague relevance. Actually, you know what? Here's how it would have gone. If it was a quick flashback, then people would have complained that Oda didn't give enough time to exploring Zoro's family. I mean, he's a protagonist after all. And then if it was an extended flashback, like say several chapters, then people would complain that Oda was bloating and elongating Wano for no reason, because this has no real hard-hitting dramatic outcome. And again, Zoro himself does not care. Family stories work well with characters like Sanji and Robin because they have more identity-focused struggles, but this fanbase sometimes has a bit of a weird fixation on biological family. I say weird because One Piece is a series deliberately created to explore found family. Time and time again, Oda has stressed that biological family practically irrelevant. But also, time and time again, the fanbase kind of fabricates a sense of importance and then gets upset when the author doesn't do the thing it is they want to do and instead sticks to his original ideas. And in the end, I think the name says it all. He's Roronoa Zoro, not Shimotsuki Zoro, which means that he embodies the random nobody villages much more so than his Wano heritage. Now, as it turns out, Tama has a hidden lineage and was confirmed to be Kurozumi Tama, which has been theorized by the fanbase for quite some time now. It's because we saw a panel of her at her parents' graves with writing that looked like it might say Kurozumi, but it was all like too squiggly to make out. However, it is now confirmed that Tama is indeed a relative of Orochi, further showing the irrelevance of biological family in this world. But this is not a topic that is free of controversy either. This was actually a really spicy SBS segment for the internet, and this is mostly because of the Kurozumi line at the end of Wano. And I would say it's specifically an issue with the scans. With the scan translation, Hiyori's line could be read as her saying that every Kurozumi was born to burn, whereas with the official translation, it made it very clear that she was only talking about Orochi. Even then, it's a talking point because Orochi himself is also a victim. He was a monster created by the people of Wano, and he could have very well turned out to be more like Tama if not for this whole Kurozumi genocide thing, which is something I agree could have been done much better. I think that Oda set up a very interesting idea there that ended up being distilled down to bad man is bad because bad. But also we had a question regarding Chopper. Good day! I really love One Piece and I've heard that Wano has ended. It's so sad that people in Wano who ate the smile fruits keep laughing. Can you make Chopper heal them before he departs? It's so sad that Killer is always laughing as well. Fair enough question, to which Oda replied, it's very sad for a child to keep laughing even if their parents died, right? But unfortunately, Chopper didn't have the ability to make that kind of drug. In this world, sometimes there are things that you can't do anything about, and this story is one of those cases. But I'm laughing because Killer keeps laughing, and it made the whole kid crew decide to become a more joyful pirate crew. It's so nice if there's joy for people even in a hard situation. I believe in the strength of the people of Wano. I mean, the introduction of Smile Fruits is one of the most gut-wrenching plot twists in the entire pirate story. Especially in retrospect with everything we know about Nika and bringing joy and happiness and just having that twisted and perverted with this stupid Caesar fruit. But this forms our trio of SBS controversy because a lot of people were not pleased with us leaving Wano without addressing this. Perhaps even having one panel where Chopper promises that one day he'll come back and cure the smile stuff. Something like that. Although I have to say, say I am completely neutral about this one. I did expect Chopper to find a smile cure because it's just the kind of thing he does, and he may still find that cure in the future. In fact, coming into contact with world-renowned fruit engineer Dr. Vegapunk may even lead to a smile cure collab down the line, because realistically, smile fruits aren't a disease. They transform your body at such a core level that I'm not sure it has a cure, at least not in the way that we traditionally think of one. And I guess there is something inspiring about encountering and overcoming adversity rather than relying on some sort of magical storybook cure. But then again, Chopper's entire dream is pretty much to find a magical storybook cure for everything, so there's always hope. But for now, we have a Sanji-related inquiry. In chapter 1032, Sanji's eyebrows were reversed, but in chapter 1044, they returned back to normal. Why did they change back to normal? Another fair question, to which Oda replies, "You have a good eye." Indeed, Sanji's eyebrows changed. Going back to the Whole Cake Island arc, Sanji's siblings were each born with superhuman abilities and a strong exoskeleton due to the manipulation of the lineage factor. However, due to his mother's interference, Sanji was born as a normal human. Oda then goes on to point out that each of the other siblings have those 66 eyebrows, while Sanji's are the opposite. However, his latent power of science manifested in the wake of his fight due to the raid suit. These powers already gave him an abnormal resistance to the heat in the past. It was a mystery before, but now it finally makes sense. Does it, Oda? Does it finally make sense? Because interestingly, I'm just going to put this out there, you didn't answer the question. The question of why his eyebrows then turned back to normal. I mean, the explanation is that his latent powers awakened, which of course changed his eyebrows to match his siblings, but why did they go back? Does that mean that Sanji can kind of deactivate his biological enhancements? Something I do know is that Kurouma, a character who has only appeared in a single chapter, is confirmed to be based on the actor Akira Kobayashi, who is best known for work in the Battles Without Honor film series, starring Bunta Sugawara, who is the visual inspiration for Fleet Admiral Sakazuki. It's a series of 11 films, which is so many. But fascinatingly, these films were produced by Toei, which also handles the One Piece anime. So everything is cyclical. You produce your live-action film series, then you produce your animated TV series featuring characters inspired by your live-action film series. But this next question is my favorite one. In chapter 1045, Next Level, Kaido says Imonogatari, an illustrated story. Does that mean that manga doesn't exist in the world of One Piece? Wait, has Kaido never read One Piece before? So in the Viz translation, Kaido says it's like something out of a comic strip, and we do know that comics exist in One Piece. The obvious one is Zoro, Warrior of the Sea, a series known all throughout North Blue and published in Big News Morgan's newspaper, featuring the marine hero Sora fight battling the evil Germa 66. Sora also being the name of Sanji's mother. But according to Oda, there are many more popular series in world. Picture books and illustrated stories do exist in One Piece. Picture books are just picture books, but think of illustrated stories as the manga in the world of One Piece. Since there is no concept of speech bubbles, the story is told through text and dialogue within a frame, similar to manga. Some famous titles in the One Piece world include Sora, Warrior of the Sea, Fire Dog, Pokémon, Monkey Ball, and Mako-san. So it's confirmed that the One Piece world has its own Pokemon series, and Monkey Ball is an obvious reference to Dragon Ball. But the one I didn't know about is the most intriguing. Maruko-san is actually quite a sad story, because it too is based on the real-world manga called Chibi Maruko-chan by author Momoko Sakura, who was a friend of Oda and tragically passed away in 2018 as a result of breast cancer. So this inclusion is a very sweet reference to one of Oda's friends. I'm curious, do the later crew members, Robin, Frankie, Brook, Jinbei, know about the adventures in East Blue, and what the veteran members, mainly Usopp, went through before they joined? This is something I've always wondered, especially with characters like Brook who know almost nothing about the pre-time skip adventures. It's a mix of knowing and not knowing, really. Considering the personalities of the original members, Luffy and Zoro both don't really talk about the past. Nami, Sanji, and Chopper will talk about it if asked. Usopp will talk about it even if you don't ask, but the adult members are good at detecting lies, so they usually get information from Nami, Sanji, and Chopper. So from this, I think the general gist is that the newer crew members know about the past, whether they want to or not, because Usopp will loudly and persistently continue to regale them with his heavily edited stories. So the rest of the crew probably only really know the half-truths of what happened before they came aboard. Also, someone requested that Oda draw Kaido after having eaten a sour plum, which is something I never knew I needed until I saw it. Zoro's domain expansion just broke One Piece. And this is pretty big news considering that last week, Zoro's Bankai broke One Piece, and the week before that, it was Zoro's Eternal Mangekyo Sharingan that broke One Piece. Today I'd like to talk about a very peculiar phenomenon specific to this fanbase. Something that drove a human being to write a 43-page thesis dissecting. I have it here, and it's a lot of paper. And it all amounts to fictional pirate controversy. More so than any anime or manga series, One Piece is a prime source of theories. There are entire channels dedicated to just making One Piece theories. No other kind of content, just theories. And to be fair, many of them are really good and well thought out pieces of speculation, but there is one very important exception. There is one ingredient that One Piece theory chefs have yet to master, and that is the gamey slab of man meat that is Roronoa Zoro. Again, to put this out there has never been a good Zoro theory, including this one, by the way, and again, this is a 43-page Zoro thesis. It's legitimately hard to explain why this exists, but I'm gonna try anyway. As an appetizer, allow me to treat you to the pirate hunter Zoro theory. This is the idea that Zoro never stopped being a bounty hunter. He just grew uninterested in making petty cash in East Blue. Nah, what this serious sword man wants is a big score. Enter Monkey D. Luffy. At the very end of the series, Zoro is going to betray Luffy. The idea is that all this time, Zoro's been playing the long game, and he's going to secure the biggest reward in bounty hunting history by capturing the Pirate King. But in order to do so, Zoro first needs to make Luffy the Pirate King. So Zoro is creating a problem purely to profit off its solution. Kind of like a firefighter committing arson so that he gets called in to put it out. And not only that, but Zoro's been acting as a double agent this entire time. I mean, remember when Zoro tried to cut off Luffy's finger when it was stuck in a bottle? Suspicious. And you might think that this sounds ridiculous. However, evidence. This has been foreshadowed by Oda because Zoro's epithet is still Pirate Hunter, even though he hasn't been a bounty hunter for well over 1,000 chapters at this point. So why is he still Pirate Hunter Zoro? Well, I guess technically he's never stopped hunting pirates. It's just now that he does it for pleasure rather than for profit. Almost all of Zoro's opponents, nay victims in the series, have been pirates. Notable exceptions include Kaku, now Rob Lucci, and well, that's actually kind of it. There was that brief skirmish with Fujitora, I suppose. But none of that matters because picture this though, right? After his inevitable betrayal, Zoro's epithet would change from Pirate Hunter to Pirate King Hunter. Admittedly, it does have a nice ring to it if you ignore, well, everything. And you may have heard this idea thrown around as a joke, but these people are very serious. And when I say serious, I mean serious, and we'll get into this shortly. But first, I have a world record for you. This is the world record for fastest theory to ever be debunked. It's known as World's Greatest Zoro, and it proposed that Zoro beat Mihawk during the time skip and is thus already the world's greatest swordsman. That would indeed be quite the twist if Zoro hadn't quite literally stated that he wasn't the world's greatest swordsman yet, which he did on Dressrosa, and when alerted to this, the theory crafter responded with, well, it's officially debunked. Only took 10 minutes after I posted this thread, lol, which I have to say is quite the graceful defeat. Most Zoro theorists are a bit more stubborn. And look, I'm not saying that there is a 2-hour documentary on YouTube from a Zoro theorist trying to justify his position after the theory was debunked, but also that does exist and that's exactly what it is. Now you might think that the cognitive blockade when it comes to Zoro spawns from pure fanboyism. The whole Zoro is cool and therefore always needs to do cool things. But that's not the case, and we can prove that with the death of Roronoa Zoro. Chapter 784 introduced us to a color spread called Picnic with Zombies. An utterly meaningless fun piece of artwork to casual fans, but an infamous symbol of caution for those of us who are chronically online. Because the ensuing idea spread like an STI at a theory orgy. And I use that analogy because the oldest known source of this theory that I can find was linked on Reddit to a site called OnePieceLove.com, which sounds like an online dating platform specifically for One Piece fans, and is honestly not a terrible idea. This website no longer exists, but apparently you can purchase the domain for $8,895 if you want some One Piece love for yourself. Luckily, on the internet, nothing is ever gone forever, so here is the full vintage theory in its original text. This cover doesn't seem too bad at first, but notice the tombstone on the lower left corner and the tombstone Zoro is sitting on. Some may think that he's sitting on a grave because they are having a picnic on a graveyard, and where else are you gonna sit? But if you look closely, Zoro is the only one sitting on a grave. The others are sitting on the grass or a tablecloth. Those tombstones have writings on them, and also are the only ones that are kind of clear to read. December 944 is written on a tombstone in the lower left corner. I believe it stands for chapter 994. Now, if you look at Zoro, he is wearing a t-shirt with a skull on it, symbol of death. And also his left hand is around a zombie, and his hat has a skull on it. Also in the background, there is a zombie dancing, and he has a skull on his hat as well. So just as a bit of a recap here, that's 3 skulls, 2 zombies, 2 hats, and 1 t-shirt. But what does it all mean? It makes me wonder if Zoro will fight someone and die in the process while having his last laugh, and if it's going to happen in chapter 944. Alright, that was a big leap. But basically the idea is that Zoro was sitting on a tombstone. That tombstone had the number 944 on it, and therefore Zoro is going to die in chapter 944. Many years then passed, almost a decade actually, and as the appointed time got closer, a Reddit thread was posted titled, "Sorry for the Zoro fans in denial, but all the evidences are here. The massive internal conflict between Zoro and the Straw Hats is happening soon. Very likely at chapter 944. Now, this thread begins with, "This post is really long, but I think it's worth your time." But it wasn't, and I'm not going to cover it. So chapter 944 was released, and rather appropriately, nothing happened. The internet had collectively wasted 8 years of their lives and moved on in despair that Zoro was not dead. But this was an 8-year theory. No one thought that anything on this scale would ever happen again, let alone bigger. And well, the we that is us, we thought wrong. So I've talked about this before in other videos, but I don't think I've ever even scratched the surface of the true extent of madness that is Zoro kills Kaido, or ZKK for short, or ZKK if you're American, because you do that. But that's what this is. On the 28th of May 2022, Twitter user Mehmet and YouTuber Fiji combined their efforts to create a 43-page dissertation titled Roronoa Zoro, the one to kill Kaido. And on the front page it also contained the disclaimer of, "Don't be scared, length is mostly due to the pictures." Also on the front page was a plug noting that Fiji was about to release a ZKK mega theory, which I'm not sure if it ever happened. However, Fiji did release an almost 2-hour documentary of the Zoro kills Kaido theory that goes over every point in this document and tries to retrospectively justify the thinking. So yes, I actually went to the effort of printing the entire thing because this is a cultural artifact. It belongs in a museum of embarrassment. And the paper culminates in a prediction of the exact chapter in which Zoro will kill Kaido. Not may, will. And this isn't just vague speculation either. The author actually develops quite a complex mathematical formula to determine the exact chapter number. It's absolutely incredible, as in not credible. Something to note from the outset is that this paper was put together after Luffy reached Gear 5th. So even at that late stage of Wano, the ZKK believers were invested harder than ever. The crux of the idea is that Zoro has parallels with the Wano samurai Ryuma. Kaido is a dragon and Ryuma slew a dragon, therefore so would Zoro, which he did do in chapter 656 and again in 1035, but he needed to do it a third time because he's the 3-sword Zoro guy. 3 is his number, except for 2 because he was the second member of the crew, and except for 1, Zoro has a thing for 1s, like his birthday, 1111, and his bounty, 1111. But 3 is what we're looking at. And if anything, a history of dragon slaying only enhances this destiny further. On page 29 of the dissertation, an effort is made to draw connections to dragons with each of Zoro's past opponents. First up, Draco Mihawk, whose name comes from Dracula, believed to be derived from the Latin Draco, meaning dragon. Well, shit a dick. Very convincing, but what else? Kaku was a giraffe fruit user. Giraffes are called Kirin in Japanese, and the Kirin is a mythical creature that heavily resembles a dragon. Meanwhile, Skybreeder Ohm can manipulate clouds just like Eastern dragons. This is all very compelling. I feel like I'm one piece of information away from believing it. What else have we got? At one point, Mr. One used an attack to make his hands look like claws. Dragon claws, to be precise. And the author also flags Shiryu, who Zoro hasn't fought yet, but it's a very popular fan assumption that they will fight. And this is important because Shi means death and Ryu means dragon. So that means that Zoro is going to fight Kill the Death Dragon. I mean, if anything, Shiryu is the one being set up to kill Kaido. He's literally called Death Dragon. On page 8, there's a list of parallels between Zoro Ryuma and Kozuki Oden, which starts with, both cannot navigate. So when it comes to these 3 characters, both of them are incapable of navigating, good to know. But the idea is to connect Zoro with the inherited will of Ryuma as well as Oden. Zoro needs to finish what Oden started, and he needs to start what Ryuma finished and then finish it himself. As a side note, all of this Ryuma stuff is based on the Monsters one-shot, which is the canon story of Ryuma. And apparently it takes place on Wano, at least according to Onimaru at least, meaning that a few hundred years ago, Wano went through a very cowboy phase before deciding on its feudal Japanese aesthetic. Now, you've probably heard of the phrase to jump the shark, but have you heard of Zoro is a shark? Well, page 12 is entirely dedicated to the Zoro-shark conundrum. So this shark, it's a problem. Because there's 3 pages in this paper trying to draw a connection to Chinese mythology. The idea is that both Zoro and Kaido are one of the 4 sacred beasts. Kaido being the eastern dragon Seryu, which to be fair, his fruit literally is, and Zoro representing the white tiger. And to continue being very fair, Zoro is generally zoomorphized as a tiger, and there's even that white tiger with a sword in its mouth on Wano. But then we arrive at the shark argument. In the SBS of volume 20, Oda revealed which animals the first 5 Straw Hats would be, and Oda stated that Zoro would be a shark. Now you probably already realize this, but this is a big problem for this paper because it dedicates 3 whole pages to justifying Zoro kills Kaido through their dragon and tiger resemblance. How could the author possibly counter this? Well, let's read. Zoro is ... a shark. These dots are also present in the Japanese version. As we can see, Oda is not sure about it. The author then goes on to claim that Oda labeling Zoro as a shark was a red herring, going so far as to draw a Zoro shark in chapter 1013 for this exact purpose, to double down on the red herring. It would spoil the end of the Wano arc for those who already know the yin and yang or dragon-tiger mythology, of course. 23 years prior to this paper being written, Oda stated that Zoro would be a shark and deliberately inserted that ellipsis because he already knew that the real answer would be a tiger. However, that would spoil readers that Zoro was going to kill an enemy who wouldn't appear until 14 years after that volume was published. I mean, Oda's foreskinning is unlike anything we've seen before. Oda is such a fantastic story planner, but people accuse him of far too much, and I say accuse because this goes beyond just giving him credit. This is actively accusing Eiichiro Oda of conspiracy to deceive the readers of his fictional pirate comic, although the author ultimately concedes that it doesn't really matter. Everything makes sense anyway because Kaido is a fish. Therefore, it is a perfect parallel. Dragon and fish versus tiger and shark. On page 33, the author notes the exact number of Kaido's Vivia card, which is 944. You may remember this number as the exact same one as the gravestone that Zoro was sitting on in the Picnic with Zombies color spread. Remember that from the Zoro will die theory? We will never be able to get rid of that color spread. And because Zoro didn't die in chapter 944, that means that his dragon-slaying butt crack is parked on the grave of whoever happens to be the unfortunately designated character number 944. Although it is a legitimately fun coincidence that that happens to be Kaido. Alright, this next part though is one of my favorite bits. On page 34, the author points out the color spread for chapter 1028, featuring Robin as a demon and Sanji as a cyborg. Now, Robin would of course go on to become a demon on Onigashima, and Sanji was revealed to be genetically enhanced. Sort of like a cyborg, but also not really, if at all. And of course, the thinking here, according to the author, is that Zoro is dressed as Link from Zelda. Link used the same sword to slay a dragon. Therefore, Zoro will slay a dragon. Also on this color spread, Jinbei is Mario, and that never really happened. Although I love that this is actually addressed in the paper by stating, Mario is a plumber, fits Jinbei and controlling water. Zoro beating King, which is a direct reference to Ryuma in Monsters, is used as evidence that Zoro was going to kill Kaido as well, because Kaido could also become a fire dragon. So just let me try and untangle this. Ryuma beating a dragon was foreshadowing for Zoro beating a dragon, which was foreshadowing for him killing another dragon shortly after. That's the logic here. And also the fact that Fire Dragon Kaido is being used as evidence here means that this paper was published after Kaido was defeated by Luffy, because he takes that form and in the very next chapter, he's down, punched into magma by Luffy. And it's from this position that the author believes that Zoro still has an opportunity to kill Kaido. Let's hear the author out though, because as stated, they were able to calculate the exact chapter number in which Zoro would kill Kaido. And that is chapter 1060, a number which was calculated to a painful degree using a pattern dictated by color spreads. Let me explain. In chapter 929 in the color spread, Zoro is shown holding a scythe, and 8 chapters later, Zoro defeats Killer, who was using a scythe. Meanwhile, 68 chapters later, Zoro cuts Queen's machine gun, and Nami was holding a machine gun in the 929 color spread. So we have 2 numbers, right? 8 and 68. But But that's not all we need to crack the code. In chapter 937, Oda creates another color spread. He can't keep getting away with this. One in which Zoro is holding a map containing the kanji Enma. And 18 chapters later, Zoro receives Enma. Are you seeing the pattern here? Probably not, and I think that's for the best. But to recap, the important numbers are 8, 18, and 68, which takes us to the color spread that gives away the entire game. In chapter 992, Zoro is depicted consuming a bowl of deliciousness. But wait, what's that? Upon this bowl is a blue dragon. And not only that, but now Zoro has been a hungry boy, with 3 empty bowls sitting under his 3 blades. 3 bowls, 3 blades, 3 Zoro number. 4 though, 4 bowls in total. And how do you say 4 in Japanese? Shi or yon, it can be both, but we're gonna go with Shi because Shi means death. Remember Shiryu, death dragon? This could not be more clear. Zoro's 4 bowls tells us that he is going to Shi the crap out of Kaido, and now all we need to do is follow the established pattern of 8, 18, and 68. 8 chapters after this color spread was published, Zoro meets Kaido for the very first time. 18 chapters after this color spread is the chapter where Zoro scars Kaido, meaning that exactly 68 chapters from this color spread is when Zoro is going to kill Kaido. And that sets Kaido's expiry date at chapter 1060. This is it. Eiichiro Oda has spent more than 2 decades painstakingly building up to this one chapter. This is the culmination of Zoro's character. It's the culmination of Kaido's character. It's the culmination of life as a whole. This is everything. And in chapter 1060, Zoro does indeed go on to kill a warm eddy by slicing it in half. Then a little goal popped up and we started Egghead Island because Kaido had already been beaten when this paper was published, and the series had long since moved on from caring about Kaido in any way, shape, or form. But as much as One Piece may have moved on, this theory will live forever. It will specifically live forever in my office bathroom where I've had it framed, so that every day as I wander in to expel some expellant, I will have the honor of being treated to this great work of humanity in the exact environment in which it belongs. I also didn't have enough frames to do the whole thing. It's a very long document, so the rest can sit with the toilet paper. And you let me know in the comments if there are any weird theories that you want explored on the channel. Who killed Kuina? This is one of the most suspicious deaths in all of fictional piracy. You might think that, it was an accident. She fell down some stairs. Nah. There is very compelling evidence in the series to suggest that Kuina's death was anything but an accident. And there are a grand total of 6 explanations as well as 3 key suspects who have been flagged in the Kuina incident, or the Ku-incident for short. Before we narrow them down and reveal the truth though, I must say that this was not an easy investigation, which is probably why this has persisted as a question for the last quarter of a century. And a lot of that is to do with wildly inconsistent information regarding the event itself. It's been portrayed 3 times across 3 different mediums, and in each and every one, the manga, the anime, and now the live action, events play out very differently and each point to a different conclusion. If you've only seen 1 or even 2 of these, then you don't have the full story. So let's figure out the truth behind the Ku-incident. Starting with the manga, this is where we first meet one Shimotsuki Kuina, daughter spawn of Shimotsuki Koshiro, and thus a descendant of the legendary samurai Shimotsuki Ryuma. This is important because it explains why she's very good at sword things. So good that she defeated fellow villager Zoro 2,000 times and proceeds to call him, quote, pathetic for a boy, and continues to antagonize him by saying that losers should learn to suffer defeat in silence. Not very nice at all. So a young Zoro, he gets a little bit upset and challenges Kuina to a duel with real swords. Kuina says, it's your funeral, which is a very poor choice of possessive pronoun considering that the very next day it would go on to become her funeral. They fight and Zoro loses, but despite this, Kuina's tough exterior breaks down and she points out that she has breasts. The implication of that being that she will never become the world's greatest swordsman because she's a girl. But Zoro doesn't take too kindly to this kind of talk, saying that when he does finally beat Kuina, it will have nothing to do with breasts and instead everything to do with being the best. They then make a promise that one day one of them will become the world's greatest swordsman. And not 24 hours later, Kuina is found dead. Cause of death, stairs. And it's never elaborated on. We don't know how many stairs, we don't know how steep the stairs were, perhaps even slippery. Stairs could be slippery, that makes them dangerous. All we know is that Kuina is no more. Highly suspicious, but I must say that things take a much more sinister turn in the anime. For one, Koshiro is painted as more of an antagonist in the anime version of these events. There's even an extra scene where he's having a discussion with some guy about how he can't allow Kuina to inherit the dojo as she is. And Koshiro even says straight to Kuina's face that she'll never become the world's greatest swordsman purely because because she's a girl. And I actually think that the anime does Koshiro a bit dirty here, because in the manga, he never mentions that Kuina being a girl is problematic. It's all very much painted as Kuina's own self-doubt. And I guess you could say it's implied that her beliefs stem from her father and her upbringing, but it's a big assumption. In the manga anyway. In the anime, it's 100% because of him. And it almost gives the impression that Koshiro is putting his hopes in Zoro surpassing Kuina and taking over the dojo, which is later reinforced by the fact that Koshiro gives Zoro the Wado Ichimonji. Interesting, because in the manga, Zoro had to ask for it. Speaking of Zoro though, the anime is much more descriptive in the events of the death itself, and it all points to a bit of tragic irony. Koshiro says, apparently she slipped and fell down the storehouse steps. Seems like she was looking for a sharpening stone for her beloved sword. And another dude replies, what would she need that for? And Koshiro says, I don't know. And then we cut to Zoro, who does know. Because this is actually quite sad, as it implies that Zoro may have played a part in Kuina's death. Kuina needed to resharpen the Wado because Zoro made her use it for their fight. Here's another big difference though. We do not see Kuina's body in the anime. Not the dead one anyway. We see the alive one, but not the dead one. Just a coffin instead. A decision probably made for censorship purposes, because showing a kid's corpse on Sunday morning probably isn't the greatest of ideas, although I do think that the episode of East Blue Special did show her body. But the spirit of Kuina also goes on to appear behind Zoro, watching him at one point, and the anime often takes a lot of creative license with the dead, like that Water 7 filler episode where the crew discovered the ghost of a Yagura bull. But the anime paints a much more visceral picture, and the live action events switch things up yet again. Here, adult Zoro gets stuck in a well, and he has to call upon the mighty powers of a flashback to get him out of it. And here we meet the most realistic looking Kuina so far, and also the most sympathetic, because after Zoro loses and throws a bit of a moss-headed tantrum, Kuina goes after him and even tries to help him with some sword-based advice. Zoro responds to this with rabba-dabba-da-da-da, general upset noises before declaring that, we're not friends. And then Zoro accuses Bamboo for providing him with his big fat L here today. So they do the thing that we've seen 3 times now, and it goes about as well as the first 2 did. Kuina wins again, and Kuina also ends up dying the very next day. But this time, the whole event is told by Koshiro in 8 words. Kuina has ellipsis. There was an accident, ellipsis. She's ellipsis. Gone, full stop probably. And Koshiro doesn't seem particularly affected by the death of his daughter, but that could just be that classic stoic samurai attitude. But what's interesting is that in the live action, Kuina no longer even has a cause of death. It's just a vague accident. And I understand why they did this, because I don't think the general audiences would react well to the whole falling down the stairs line, because it does sound suspicious as crap. That's actually why this whole video exists. And in the West, falling down the stairs is also kind of code for domestic abuse. And even if it wasn't, it still sounds like a ridiculous cause of death for a fictional character. However, I would argue that not saying the cause of death at all also makes it pretty mighty suspicious. An accident? What sort of accident? Well, the accidental kind. I don't understand, Sensei. Can you elaborate? Nope. But shut up, Zoro! You go and re-practice your sword thing. It's mighty suspicious, but I will say that live-action Koshiro does have some sense when it comes to the Wado Ichimonji itself, because he says, the Wado Ichimonji is a rare blade. Why should I allow you to carry it? A wise hesitancy, considering that Zoro goes on to lose it in Shellstown, which leads Helmeppo to rub his man-junk against it. And in universe, do you think every time that Zoro puts that sword in his mouth, he remembers where the Wado has been? Maybe that's why he doesn't really use 3-sword style all that much in the live action. But utilizing his drive to become the world's greatest swordsman, Zoro eventually defeats the Well and goes on to beat 2 people who are sort of dressed as cats. And it should be noted that live action Zoro has indeed learned from the coincident, as he defeats Sham by pushing her down some stairs, which I think is almost certainly a Kuina reference. But what about Kuina herself? Because no matter which medium we look at, I just don't buy it. And there are 6 possible explanations for Kuina departing the battlefield of life, each stranger and more compelling than the last. The first is to take the explanation at face value. It's just an accident, and that's life. In the manga, it even makes a point of saying, humans are fragile things, which I guess goes towards the idea of seizing the day. You should chase your dreams now because you never know when your time's going to be up. Despite that idea, however, the mundane and meaningless cause of death has become quite a meme in the One Piece community, with Kuina's stairs even being personified as one of the most powerful characters in the entire series, named Down D Stairs. A sentiment which I think is best represented by this fan art of the how high will your ceiling go moment, featuring the 5 meme emperors of One Piece: Buggy the Clown, Gangsta Gastino, Foxy, Condoriano, and of course the legendary original meme emperor, Down D Stairs. And with the live action, a lot of people were also speculating on who or what was going to play the infamous Down D Stairs, with Chris Pratt being quite a popular choice. And Kuina's live action actress Audrey Simone has even come out with an official statement regarding the matter.
Do you want to form an alliance with me?
Absolutely, I do.
Good, good.
But what if I told you that there was a much more convincing explanation involving down these stairs, but as an accomplice rather than the culprit? Well, recently we've really hammered home in One Piece that swords have distinct personalities of their own, as well as agency to do things to some degree, at least the special ones. And this is something we've known for a while with the various curse swords, but Zoro's interaction with Enma showed that the blade was actively testing him and even capable of extracting his delicious, delicious haki. Now, Enma was crafted by Shimotsuki Kozuburo, who also made the Wado Ichimonji. So do you see where we might be going here? The Wado Ichimonji may have been testing Kuina, and she failed. So in a very One Ring act, it sabotaged her so that it could move on to the next candidate. It seems a bit brutal and weird for One Piece, but also that's exactly what Enma would have done. If Zoro failed its test, Enma would have killed Zoro and patiently waited for its next candidate. So the Wado could have forcibly drawn out Kuina's latent haki. And because she's not used to using it, this causes her to lose bodily control and faint. Like, oh no, and then stairs happen to be there, and Kuina falls either on the sword itself or in a conveniently death-inducing spot on said stairs. Wado then says to itself, "Good job, me," and then sits there waiting for Zoro. A compelling story, but the evidence against this would be that the Wado of all of the special swords is the one who has thus far shown no personality whatsoever. Before moving on, I should address the Tashigi in the room. I don't know why she's always in the room, but she is, and we're going to talk about her. So a lot of people are probably screaming at the screen throughout this video because they know that Tashigi is Kuina. And to be fair, a lot of that is because the author himself has very much led us down that road. What with Zoro saying that she looks exactly like Kuina, as well as Tashigi's obsession with swords. So the idea would be that the coincident caused some sort of amnesia. And for reasons, Koshiro decided that this would be a good opportunity to dump his daughter somewhere else. Maybe as a way of giving her a fresh start to achieve her dream that she may or may not still have due to the amnesia, but to do so without the stigma that only men can be the best at swinging the sharp metals. What's interesting is that we know almost nothing about Tashigi's history except that she was born in East Blue and she likes swords. She really likes swords. Just like Kuina. And in the anime, Tashigi takes her Kuina cosplay so far that she even almost kills herself with a sword by falling down some stairs. Swords and stairs are just natural enemies, it seems. Plus, in the timeline, Tashigi is 23 years old post-time skip, which is painfully close to the age that Kuina would be today if she was still alive. There's legitimately only 1 year separating them, but they do have different birthdays. And Oda even put an end to the conspiracy theory that he himself started in the SBS of Volume 68, where he drew Tashigi as a child. And while still similar and did appear to train in a dojo, she is distinctly different from Kuina. I personally think that at one point Oda may have intended for Tashigi to be Kuina, or at the very least he wanted to leave that door open in case he decided, let's go through. But even if so, that idea has long since been abandoned. So let's get a bit darker. If you look into this topic on the internet, an explanation you'll commonly see on things like Reddit threads is that falling down the stairs is a metaphor in Japan. As in, it's a very polite way of saying that someone committed suicide. And if you ever see that, just disregard it. No one has ever been able to provide a shred of evidence that this is in fact a thing. However, the actual theory, minus the fake cultural relevance, isn't terrible though. The idea that Kuina, even after her conversation with Zoro, was still in such despair over her dream that she decided it wasn't worth living. It's a very dark interpretation though, and one that I don't think is consistent with the broader ideology of One Piece, and the anime presentation in particular is also very against this idea. In the anime, Kuina doesn't die immediately the next day. Time passes. We see both Zoro and Kuina train, so this Kuina certainly has not given up, and if anything is redoubling her efforts. But the anime does also give us something of an antagonist to work with. In the manga, anime, and live action actually, Koshiro is never depicted as particularly sad about his daughter's death, and it has been suggested that it was he who did the deed and blamed it on the stairs. The theory is that Koshiro did not want his daughter to become a swordsman. This is due to his upbringing as a Wano samurai with the classic attitude that samurai equals man. But little does Shimotsuki Village know that Wano has become a much more progressive place under the rule of Kaido. These days, not only can women become samurai, but so can trans women, dogmen, fishmen, giant baboons, and also whatever the hell Jizo is. I'm not actually sure, to be honest. He's sort of like a living statue man. But what I do know is that he is a samurai. The Koshiro theory is definitely most strongly supported, if you can call it that, by the anime, because this is where Koshiro actually has a motive. He states that he cannot let Kuina inherit the dojo in her current state, whatever that is, and and he actively denies the pursuit of her dream. And should Kuina not obey his wishes, it might be his call to arrange an accident and to put the honor of his dojo onto the shoulders of another unsuspecting sword-obsessed child. I don't think this theory works as well in the manga, if at all, because Koshiro is barely shown. And when he is, he appears to be quite proud of Kuina. So in the manga, he has no motive. But I should also say that there is a chance that Kuina is still alive in a non-Toshigi way, because our final theory is that Kuina is still alive, and that her death was but a clever ruse to allow her, or should I say, to allow him, to go out and pursue his dream. In chapter 589, Will of the Winds, we see Dragon and his revolutionary army docking at Shimotsuki Village after having left the Goa Kingdom, and we also see both Zoro and Kuina training respectively. But Emporio Ivankov is aboard the ship, which puts him within striking distance of making all of Kuina's hopes and dreams come true. He quite literally has the power to give Kuina everything she's ever wanted, which boils down to a penis and the physical enhancements that seem to naturally spawn from it. Now, Emporio Ivankov is famous worldwide as a miracle worker. It's not beyond the scope of belief that even those in East Blue would have heard of his miracles. And when Dragon comes to Shimotsuki Village, Koshiro sees an opportunity for his daughter and asks Ivankov if he wouldn't mind doing him a bit of a favor. One problem with this idea, though, is that the timelines don't match up perfectly. Zoro famously fought Kuina under a full moon, and the Revolutionary Army docked during a half moon. So at the very least, this change could not have happened on this particular night. But given that Shimotsuki Village is friendly to the Revolutionary Army, this means that it may not be the only occasion that they stopped by. So it's possible, but the bigger question is, if this did happen, why would they then go to the trouble of faking Kuina's death? And in the manga, we pretty clearly see the body as well, so we'd have to believe that this was Kuina just pretending to be dead. And most importantly, what's Kuina been doing ever since? We have yet to meet or hear of any Kuina-shaped swordsman, so even in this best case scenario, the whole dream pursuit thing is probably going pretty badly. But I think the series is being a bit too hopeful. What I will say for the reality of the situation is that Kuina's life was a series of very cruel maneuvers. Being born with a body that she believed didn't support her dreams, then having the only person in the world who could magically change her body be in her village and Kuina never knowing, but then finally coming to terms with the idea that it didn't matter and that she could become the world's greatest swordsman, only to have all of her fears come to life and ultimately take her life with a mere set of stairs ending her existence the very next day. And as the anime implies, it may have happened as a direct result of Zoro's fight and subsequent encouragement. It's pure tragedy. But you let me know in the comments, what do you think is the truth behind the coincidence? If I retreat even one step, my vow, my ambition, and my dream will be lost forever. One day we'll fight for the title. It's a promise. The world's greatest swordsman, the king of the pirates, is going to need him. He has to join my crew. However long it may take, I will await you at the top. Strive to surpass me. This is my last chance. It's win or die. Greatest in the world or death. Roronoa Zoro. Bounty hunter, alcohol enthusiast, and profound dreamer. In fact, Zoro's ever-expanding shoulders carry not just one, but two dreams. That of his childhood rival Kuina, and that of his current captain, Monkey D. Luffy. Two different paths that will ultimately lead him to the same destination in order to challenge the world's greatest. Which is a journey that begins in a rather superficial way, really. Zoro grew up in a tiny East Blue village known as Shimotsuki, studying swordsmanship at the local dojo. At this point, a miniature Zoro had an inexplicable lust for power and desire to become the world's greatest swordsman, which served him very well, swiftly rising to a level of skill capable of defeating every other student, even the adults. However, there was one person in the village whom Zoro could not defeat, being the dojo master's daughter, Kuina. In fact, during their time together, Zoro fought Kuina 2001 times, and he lost exactly 2001 of those matches. Highly frustrating for Zoro, and this feeling would be matched by Kuina, who concluded that Zoro would eventually surpass her due to him being a boy, an idea that infuriated Zoro to no end, claiming that one day he would defeat Kuina through hard work alone rather than genetics. The two of them then made a promise that one day they would fight each other for the title of world's greatest swordsman. Although in a case of very unfortunate timing, Kuina died the very next day, and after this tragic accident, Zoro took up her sword and vowed to be the one to keep that promise, embarking on a quest to become the world's greatest swordsman for both of them. A quest that would see him travel all across East Blue, primarily primarily because Zoro, well, he lacked any sense of direction. He basically got lost, that's what I'm trying to say. And after an unsavory incident involving a man with a butt chin and his dog, Zoro found himself being scheduled for execution, only to be saved by a most unlikely man-boy thing who was wearing a straw hat. Having heard word of a fearsome swordsman alone, Monkey D. Luffy had traveled to Shell's Town, offering to free Zoro in exchange for becoming the first member to join the newly developed Straw Hat Pirates. And when faced with the choice of dying right here and now, thus not keeping his promise, or initiating a rather abrupt career change to become a pirate, well, Zoro chose the latter. And thus the greatest duo in One Piece was born, with Luffy not only supporting but insisting that Zoro become the world's best swordsman, because the future Pirate King would require nothing less than that. And unlike every other Straw Hat, Zoro would actually be given the opportunity to accomplish his dream extraordinarily early on, when the crew landed on the floating restaurant Baratier and encountered a man named Dracula Mihawk, who just so happened to be the current wielder of the world's greatest swordsman title. Of course, Zoro immediately challenged him because, well, why not? I mean, one reason may have been because Zoro was wildly ill-equipped physically, mentally, or even swordsmanly for this particular challenge. And to put this into some perspective, Dracula Mihawk was a world-renowned figure who had traveled the Grand Line and the New World all on his own and in a teeny tiny boat thing, and he was feared enough by the world government to have been made a warlord of the sea, as well as a one-time sparring partner of one of the 4 emperors, specifically the one with the reddest of hair. Meanwhile, in the other corner, we had green hair, and under that green hair was Zoro, who, well, by this point, the only thing he'd really done, come to think of it, was defeat an acrobat on a unicycle, so this was hardly going to be the clash of the century. In fact, this was such a non-event that Mihawk refused to actually use a sword, instead deciding to wield this comically small knife thing. And what followed was something of a sick joke, with Zoro unable to overcome the glorified butter knife with the skills that he had been intensely training his whole life to acquire. However, the one thing that Zoro did have going for him was sheer spirit. No matter how outclassed he was, Zoro refused to back down. If I retreat even one step, my vow, my ambition, and my dream will be lost forever. And seeing a spark of potential within this otherwise pitifully weak man, Mihawk elected to reward Zoro by finishing him off with his actual sword, sending Zoro to the brink of death, but not before issuing a challenge. Don't be in such a hurry to die, young warrior. However long it may take, I shall await you at the top. Strive to surpass me, Roronoa Zoro. After which point, Zoro tearfully vowed to never lose again, not just for himself, not just to fulfill Kuina's dream either, but also as a direct promise to Luffy. For his captain to become the Pirate King, Zoro would need to become the world's greatest swordsman, and well, that was kind of that. It had to happen, so it was going to. From here on out, Zoro would fight wave after wave of opponents with renewed vigor. When thrown up against a foe with 8 swords, Zoro simply stated, "You may have 8 swords, but they cannot compare to the weight behind my 3. When thrown up against a man who could literally turn to steel, Zoro's resolve was such that he learned how to cut steel within that very battle. Whether it was a disciple of God, an elite world government assassin, or even the zombified remains of a samurai legend, Zoro never faltered, overcoming each and every one of them with a very simple philosophy. Even if most people would pass out from wounds like these, I cannot fall. Even if most people would die from wounds like these, I cannot fall. I have to defeat that man, so I cannot fall." However, Zoro's greatest challenge yet would come not in the form of a physical task, but rather a life-defining choice. On the rather quirky, zombie-infested island of Thriller Bark, the Straw Hat Pirates found themselves caught in an exceptionally desperate situation, having expended all of their energy on defeating one warlord of the sea, only to be immediately faced by another. A certain Bartholomew Kuma, a very intriguing man, a cyborg, manborg, a very intriguing manborg. But Kuma basically offered the crew a compromise, to spare all of their lives in exchange for handing over their captain Luffy, which, well, it didn't go down well for anyone involved, actually. The Straw Hat Pirates completely refused, thus thwarting Kuma's offer, and then they proceeded to be absolutely devastated by the warlord, which they had no hope of victory against. In the end, only one remained standing, and rather appropriately, it was the person who had been consistently telling himself that he could not fall. Despite that creed, in this situation, defeat was inevitable. So Zoro had to make a decision. The choice choices in front of him were either to die in combat against an insurmountable opponent, thus leaving he and Kuina's ambition to become the world's greatest swordsman unfulfilled, or he could surrender the life of his captain and forfeit Luffy's dream of becoming the Pirate King. And that's very much the problem of shouldering two dreams. They're not always going to be compatible, and at this very moment, Zoro needed to decide whose dream to abandon, the memory of Kuina or the future of Luffy. And all things considered, he came to a decision startlingly quickly. I can't say I'm as famous as Luffy, but if you consider that someday I would have been the world's greatest swordsman, then it can't be too much of a loss to you. Take my head instead. To which Kuma simply replied, very well, I give you my word that I will not take the head of Straw Hat Luffy today, but in exchange, I will give you a glimpse of hell. At which point, Kuma used his Devil Fruit abilities to gather all of Luffy's pain, suffering, and fatigue into a tangible bubble. To an already severely wounded Zoro, it was pretty much a big bowl of death. It's very rare that you see such a straightforward interpretation like this in any kind of media, but in this moment, Zoro quite literally took on all of Luffy's burdens, his pain, his life, and most importantly, his dream. And after diving down into the pits of hell, Zoro emerged on the other side, mere breaths away from death, but most importantly, still standing. Exactly how one human managed to survive this is unknown. Some credit raw durability, whilst others say that Zoro's sense of direction was so bad that he got lost on the way to hell. However, to me, the answer is rather simple. Even if most people would die from wounds like these, I cannot fall. Those words have never and likely will never be more true than they were on that day. Through sheer ambition, Zoro had managed to preserve everything that he held dear. However, even loitering on the doorstep of death, the true ordeal was far from over. Having barely survived the chaos of Thriller Bark, the very next island would show no such mercy. After an incident involving a Marine Admiral, an obese bodyguard, and the return of Warlord Bartholomew Kuma, the Straw Hats were completely defeated and scattered throughout the world, with Zoro landing in a most intriguing location. Kuregana Island, better known as the home territory of the world's greatest swordsman, Drakul Mihawk. And as such, Zoro would be forced to confront his rival in the most sorry state of his entire existence. Yes, even more so than when he was crying on the boat. But in this case, he was still greatly wounded from Thriller Bark, still wielding nothing even close to the skill of Mihawk, and most importantly, he had failed to stay by his captain's side. And so on an island consisting of only his greatest rival, a miscellaneous ghost girl, and horde after horde of combat-savvy baboons, Zoro would swallow his pride and turn to the one he thought was capable of helping him most. It should be the baboons, actually. It's pretty funny. But after he dispatched all of the super-powered baboons, Zoro was left with no choice but to confront Mihawk. And in a rather stunning show of humility, Zoro met with his ultimate ambition and bowed before him. Quite different from their initial confrontation on Baratie, where Zoro rocked up to the world's greatest swordsman, proud and cocky, ready to take that title by force. But this time around, Zoro was an order of magnitude more wise, knowing that no matter how strong he had become since Baratie, it was still nothing compared to the mountain yet to climb. Please teach me what you know. Teach me to surpass you. A statement which was met by a fit of laughter from Mihawk, and to be fair, look, it is a completely absurd idea. Why train someone for the ultimate task of defeating you, the person who is doing the train? Seems very counterproductive. The thing is though, behind Zoro's words, Mihawk saw a deeper meaning. A proud man like Zoro would not simply bow before him for the sake of his own dream. There was another part to this equation, one that Mihawk knew had to do with the straw hat clad boy that he had also met on that fateful bright sunny day. And while the events of Thriller Bark are quite understood, this is definitely one of the most understated and underrated actions from Zoro. Within his personal code of honor, it's one thing to put your life on the line for the sake of another, very much akin and in line with the Japanese moral guidelines of Bushido, but it is completely another to admit your weakness and beg your greatest enemy to whip you into shape. And that's not very Bushido. In fact, I'd go so far as to say it's quite Bushi-no. Regardless, Mihawk saw this greater drive and ultimately decided to train the man who would one day come to defeat him. And 2 years later, the results of that training were on full display when Zoro reunited with the crew, going on to display previously unimaginable skills and determined to go all the way this time. He would not be stopped again. This time, he was going to become the world's greatest swordsman, and Luffy was going to become the Pirate King. I will never lose again. From now till the day I beat him to become the world's greatest swordsman, I will never lose again. Got a problem with that, King of the Pirates? Who would win in a fight battle? Zoro or Katakuri? Commander versus Commander. Future Sight versus Advanced Conqueror's Haki. And Sharp Metal versus Delicious Malleable Mochi. This is a fairly tough matchup for anyone to call. But I can tell you that the general public opinion tends to lean in the direction of one of two buckets. You've got either Katakuri, because I like him more, or Zoro low diffs dat ass. Actually, there's also a third confusing yet noteworthy bucket. Bro, currently even ulti is stronger than Katakuri. So with that in mind, we're going to change this video to Zoro versus ulti, Commander versus 1/6 of the Flying Six, Advanced Conqueror's Haki versus not that, and Sharp Metal versus Blunt Heavy Dinosaur Head. Alright, let's do a deep dive into this matchup. And as it turns out, Zoro already won off screen while I was announcing it. Great! So what do we do now? Back to Katakuri, I suppose. So if you look up Zoro versus Katakuri on Google, the always correct source of information, the first result I get is from a One Piece card game tournament. It's a Katakuri deck versus a Zoro deck, and according to this scientific investigation, Katakuri won. This is quite literally the closest thing we have to a canon answer regarding this fight. But I was wondering if we could come up with a more substantial resolution. To put my own personal bias out there, I am such a big fan of Zoro that I do literally own a life-size statue of him who lives in my office, adorned by a variety of other primarily Zoro-based merchandise. But I'm also such a big fan of Katakuri that I once bought a can of coffee that I have no intention of drinking just because it has his face on it. So I'm gonna go ahead and call myself fairly unbiased here. Now, to be clear, what we are using is post-Wano Zoro and Whole Cake Island Katakuri, primarily because we don't know anything about post-Wano Katakuri. He might be stronger, he might be not. Quite frankly, I don't care. Both are first commanders of an Emperor of the Sea. However, if we examine the bounty county, Zoro is worth more, a whopping 1.111 billion berries, with Katakuri ending his day of trading at 1,057 million berries. So as far as the world government is concerned, Zoro stocks are a more solid addition to the investment portfolio, and in fictional pirate terms, that means that they think Zoro is a bigger threat. However, this gap is small enough that it's a meaningless difference. And to be honest, the entire number is kind of meaningless because King's bounty was higher. That was like 1.390 billion money units. And as a result, there's a common train of logic here, which results in the following mathematical equation. King is greater than Katakuri, Zoro is greater than King, therefore Zoro is greater than Katakuri. Now, from what we saw, to be honest, I think that both Zoro and Katakuri are greater than King. That's why this video is about them and not him. But going into this matchup, Zoro does step into combat with the greatest of win-loss records. He's actually officially one of the biggest losers in all of One Piece, with 2,001 losses to Kuina alone. It should be said that Zoro did the majority of his losing during his early years, whereas in the modern day, it's arguable that Zoro has only lost once. And that would be to one Drakeul Mihawk, after which point Zoro declared that he would never lose again. And if we don't count racist fishermen, lightning gods, and this chimney he got stuck in that one time on Water 7, then Zoro has kept his word. This is where it gets exciting though, because Katakuri is the exact opposite. Katakuri has done 100% of his losing in the modern day, with an allegedly flawless record prior to Luffy. And Katakuri has a very similar I will never lose again philosophy to Zoro. The only difference being one word, because Katakuri simplified this idea to I will never lose, which is unfortunate because one of them has to lose. With the first and biggest factor of this fight being Haki. This is the primary difference between Zoro and Katakuri. Both are users of all three brands of Haki, however both have pursued their own advancement. Katakuri took the path of observation to the conclusion of Future Sight, so Katakuri can see a handful of seconds into the future, which is stupidly powerful. Meanwhile, Zoro got lost, fell down a hill, and landed into a steaming pile of Advanced Conqueror's Haki, which means that he can cut things that are like really hard. We're talking leaving a permanent scar on Kaido levels of hard, although sadly he's not able to show it off due to the whole Kaido lava bath thing. So here's what it comes down to. If Zoro can land a hit on Katakuri, then we're probably done here. His attack power is so far beyond what Katakuri can produce. And Katakuri may not immediately go down, but if the Moss Head can wound Kaido, then Katakuri is being chopped up and served as Unagi even with the Mochi regeneration, remembering that it's a Paramecia, not a Logia, so it does have limits. But all of this is assuming that Zoro is either fast enough or smart enough to actually hit Katakuri. Is Zoro fast enough to pull off a Snake Man? I'd say that's very unlikely. Even if he was, the key thing about Snake Man is that it confused poor little Katakuri. All of a sudden, punches were coming out of directions that even Future Sight wasn't able to fully predict. And also, even if he does dodge, the Python attack literally just continued getting faster and faster until it eventually hit something, usually Katakuri. So it was a perfect counter to Katakuri, one which I don't think Zoro has an equivalent of. of. If Future Sight continuously stops Zoro's hits, then Katakuri should eventually get the better of him, but that could take a long time. Which brings up a thing. The longer the fight goes on for Katakuri, the higher the risk that at some moment he's going to lose concentration and give Zoro an opening. Which may very well happen because he will get particularly annoyed if and when he misses his merienda. This is the only form of stress relief that Katakuri has in life, so without it, he's going to become a very upset boy. So if Katakuri wins, it needs to be quickly. The issue being that, look, I don't think that Katakuri has an attack strong enough to quickly bring down Zoro, which isn't so much due to Katakuri's lack of power, but more Zoro's out of this world durability. What we're looking at here could be a Luffy-esque 12-hour fight because both Zoro and Katakuri have never give up attitudes and the willpower to match that. Katakuri will never give up because he needs to retain his perfection, and Zoro will never give up until the last drop of blood has left his body. In terms of actual physical durability, I'd probably lean in favor of Zoro, but that's only because he's very experienced when it comes to being beaten up, whereas Katakuri isn't actually used to getting hit. He uses Future Sight to dodge most things, and Armament Haki to block anything he can't dodge. But when he does get hit, he takes that damage so much harder than a punching bag like Zoro, which isn't to undersell the stamina of Katakuri, not at all. Even when his fight against Luffy ended, Katakuri still wasn't out of stamina. He was ready to keep going. The fight ended because he conceded. But this match has a pretty crazy X factor going for it that the Luffy versus Katakuri fight did not, which is the question of Haki level ups. Would Zoro pull a Luffy? Would he see that Katakuri has Future Sight and just decide to learn it for himself? It's not out of character at all. In fact, it's exactly what he did against Daz Bones. Keep on struggling till the brink of death and then learn to cut steel / use Haki, just like old mate Rayleigh said. The real advancement in Haki happens during extreme use in battle. This experience could result in Zoro learning Future Sight, but also the opposite could happen as well, because they both have something that the other one lacks. Zoro could develop Future Sight, but Katakuri could unlock advanced Conqueror's Haki. Against Luffy, Katakuri had no chance for this advancement because he never faced a power greater than his own. But if Zoro were to whip out a shiny new Haki, then Katakuri, in his quest to be the perfect being, would also strive for it. It's a really great fight because both combatants are driven enough to make one another stronger, but also very bad for this video because that results in them being deemed roughly equal. A question we should ask is, how overpowered is Future Sight? Well, according to Emperor of the Sea Red Hair Shanks, the answer is very, but according to Emperor of the Sea Kaido, the answer is not very, because as far as we know, Kaido does not have Future Sight, and that wasn't a huge benefit for Luffy at any stage of their fight. So if this is even possible, I feel like Future Sight is both overestimated and underestimated at the same time. But also, as much as Katakuri may want it to be, it's not perfect. Future Sight isn't the be-all and end-all. A lot of the time, even though Katakuri could see Luffy's attacks coming, the only way he could deal with them was to counter with an attack of his own. There were times when dodging just wasn't an option, and that would be more difficult against Zoro due to the one-up Conqueror's Haki advantage. So Katakuri is more or less forced to always dodge because he cannot afford to take Zoro's hits, which even with Future Sight may not always be possible. And eventually, with enough time, Katakuri's probably gonna get hit. However, stepping away from Haki for a bit, this fight would be something completely different at first because it would be a swords versus trident matchup, but then it would quickly transition into swords versus mochi. On a surface level, Katakuri's powers are a terrible matchup for Zoro because mochi plus Future Sight equals a low gear effect, the bane of swordsmen. Except with Katakuri, it's even worse because it's a low gear effect you cannot counter with Haki because he's not actually cutting anything. Although the disadvantage of that is that if Zoro does hit Katakuri even without Haki, he has no low gear intangibility, and as a result, he's gonna get hurt. Big potential weakness though, swords. Zoro relies on equipment. I mean, yes, he has no sword style attacks, but he can't face a serious opponent completely sword nude, which means that Katakuri has a rather unique win condition. It could become less about fighting Zoro and defeating him at 100% and more about disarming him. But the question is, would Katakuri accept that? I don't think so. I feel like his pride would demand that he overcome Zoro at his best. So that's good news for Zoro, but also I have more bad news. He has another sword weakness, which is that Enma is one hell of a thirsty boy. Against King, Enma was very needy and kept sucking Zoro's Haki dry, putting him on a rather severe time limit, and using Enma against Katakuri could result in a similar effect. It's hard to tell because we don't know what the relationship with Enma is post-King. Back then, Enma was testing Zoro, but that might just be the cost of using Enma, and if so, that changes changes the dynamic completely. Zoro needs to beat Katakuri before Enma drains him, and Katakuri would be the most frustrating possible opponent for those conditions. It's also important to note that Katakuri is an awakened Devil Fruit user, I guess. I say I guess because it's something that I have a tendency to forget because it wasn't all that relevant against Luffy. It was used a handful of times and not to a particularly amazing effect. What it really equates to is Katakuri has more mochi to throw at Zoro. But Zoro is a bad match for Katakuri as well. Like Luffy's rubber, mochi is good at tanking blunt force attacks really well, not slicing. That's why we have diced mochi as a dish. But the conclusion here is that we have way too many variables. Zoro has more powerful attacks, but Katakuri might be impossible to hit with said attacks. What I think it comes down to is whoever has the burden of winning the quickest. If Katakuri needs to win before he gets frustrated or loses concentration, then he probably loses. Whereas if Zoro needs to win before Enma kills him, then he probably loses. And this could go on for a long time. If both combatants manage to keep their cool and keep their lives, then it becomes a matter of who promotes their abilities first. Does Zoro unlock Future Sight, or does Katakuri unlock Advanced Conquerors? Whoever promotes first then has a pretty big advantage over the other one and could secure victory in that moment. But if both promote around the same time, then we're back to even, and it becomes a test of pure durability and willpower, which could really go either way. So I'm relying on you, people on the internet, to provide me with an answer to this mess. And holy crap, I was not expecting this. Zoro absolutely dominated this poll. This is worse than Shanks versus Mihawk. I honestly thought that this would be more even, if not slightly in Katakuri's favor. I guess I'm very out of touch. Although I do find it quite interesting that these results correlate almost exactly with the which character do you like better poll. Always funny how these polls seem to line up. But at least Katakuri did go on to win the who would be a better dinner guest poll by quite a margin as well, assumedly due to his dedication to manners in public. But here's the final verdict on this fight. Here is exactly how it's going to go down. Zoro probably gets lost on his way to the fight, and Katakuri wins by default. Unfortunate, but almost certainly the case. These are the 15 most powerful swords in One Piece. Swords are very serious business in this fictional pirate series. However, ranking them is surprisingly simple, primarily because the world has its own intricate scaling system. It's known as the Meito scale, and it categorizes swords into basic grade, skillful grade, great grade, and of course, supreme grade, the bestest of all of them. And you would be shocked at just how few swords we've encountered in the series that fit into the Meito system at all. It's a very rare and very special specimen that makes it to even the lowest of the Meito grade. So let's start with the basic grade Sandai Kitetsu, a cursed sword crafted by Kozuki Sukiyaki, former shogun of Wano, and despite being one of the most undisputed, most powerful swords in the world, it only carries a market value of around 50,000 berries, which is roughly half the value of a log pose and approximately 333 cabbages. It's even cheap enough that I've got one. And the reason why this sword is so cheap is because most of its owners are desperate to get rid of it. As stated before, this is a cursed blade, and is said to bring a horrible death to each of its owners. It's not good for me, is it? Of every sword in the world, the one most notable for its sharpness is the Sandai Kitetsu. It packs a much more volatile bite than most, which makes unfortunate life-changing or even life-claiming accidents very easy to suffer. And when Zoro encountered this blade, he decided to test his luck, threw it up in the air, just to see if the cursed sword would slice off his arm. And this gambit seems to have earned the respect of the Sandai Kitetsu because, bear this in mind, swords in One Piece are more than just objects. They are imbued with the will of their creators and take on personalities of their own, with Oda having once even personified the Sandai Kitetsu, showing its very sneaky and deceptive nature. This sword will end your life the very first chance it gets, whether you're its opponent or its wielder. And so it takes someone pretty damn special or pretty damn mentally ill to wield the Sandai Kitetsu successfully. But also within the lower grade blades is Shigure, Toshigi's prized sword that was introduced in the same chapter as the Sandai Kitetsu. However, it's a much more reasonable cutting partner, and its name roughly translates as Autumn Rain. We don't actually know anything about who crafted Shigure or where it's from, but given that it's a katana, it seems fairly likely that it also originates from Wano. And whilst it is quite powerful, the main draw of Shigure is technique, pure technique. It is best put to use by extremely well-practiced and masterful swordsmen, considered to be more of a scalpel than a cleaver. In a contest of raw strength, Shigure will crumble. So for example, Zoro will often use the Sandai Kitetsu to slice through cannonballs. However, Toshigi uses Shigure to deflect them. It just doesn't pack the sheer oomph of the most powerful swords. However, for painfully precise attacks, it will still devastate opponents like nothing else. Which is part of the struggle with Toshigi, who is a sword enthusiast, but a clumsy one and not yet at the level of mastery that her preferred blade requires. And every sword from here requires no less than that mastery because we are moving into the skillful grade blades. And after proving himself with the Sandai Kitetsu, Zoro was given the skillful grade Yubashiri for free from sword store owner Ippon Matsu. He did this as a form of inherited will. Knowing that he, Ippon Matsu, would never go on to become a great swordsman himself, he entrusted his dream to Zoro. Yubashiri's unique feature is that it's incredibly light, and for quite some time it was Zoro's most versatile sword as a result. And speaking of versatility, Yubashiri is also one of the few, if any other swords in the series, that has been completely transformed to become a new blade. Specifically, when Zoro and Usopp were handcuffed together during any slobby, Usopp ended up holding Yubashiri, and Zoro wielded Usopp himself, naming this temporary abomination the Hana Arashi, meaning nose storm. And this might also be a reference to Zoro's father, who was named Arashi. Roronoa Arashi, Roronoa Storm. But unfortunately, this was the last great feat of Yubashiri, because shortly after this, the sword was destroyed by Marine Captain Shu with the abilities of the Rust Fruit, and Zoro officially laid Yubashiri to rest on Thriller Bark alongside the Rumbar Pirate's grave. But next up, we've gone from Zoro to Toshigi, back to Zoro, and now back to Toshigi, because she discovered our next most powerful sword known as Kashu, which was confiscated from the Baroque Works agent Mr. 11. In retrospect, it's insane that a Baroque Works member had such a powerful and valuable sword. He clearly didn't have the skill to use it though, or else he wouldn't have got caught and the blade wouldn't have been taken. Toshigi liberated Kashu as her dream is to take custody of each of the world's most powerful swords so that they can never be abused by criminals, pirates, and other ne'er-do-wells. Sadly, we don't know a lot about Kashu, we've never seen it used in combat, but Toshigi's reaction tells us that this is quite an elegant creation, which is hinted at by its name, meaning flower province, and Kashu is certainly capable of competing on the top levels of sharp metal ling in One Piece. And Toshigi also liberated another of the skillful grade swords named Yama Orochi, and we don't have an official image of this one because it happened during the Logtown arc novel. This is a bit of a weird situation because usually the novels there of, dubious canon, they're not written by Oda himself, but the Logtown novel is a bit different because it was based on Oda's notes and desires that he didn't have time to include in the manga. And in One Piece Magazine Volume 6, Yama Orochi is officially listed as a canon Meito blade, so that's why we're going to go with that. Yama Orochi means wind blowing down from the mountain, and this is a very big boy sword. It was described as exceptionally large and it belonged to a man named Billy the Orca Killer. So this is the exact opposite of Shigure, which was made as a refined tool, whereas Yama Orochi was made for cleaving, butchering, and general blunt and violent activities. Powerful, yes, but such a crude tool could never make it past the skillful grade. But what does is the first installment of our great grade blades being the Nidai Kitetsu, which is actually the sword that the Sandai Kitetsu was based on, as Kozuki Sukiyaki sought to create something on par with a member of the 21 great grade blades. However, the Nidai Kitetsu was created by a man named Kotetsu, an ancestor of Sukiyaki who we unfortunately know little about. However, the Nidai Kitetsu is significantly more powerful and also more cursed than the Sandai Kitetsu, with its presence so overt that Zoro was able to sense it without even wielding it. Although funnily enough, the only person to have ever used this sword in the series was, of all people, Luffy. He very non-consensually borrowed it from Sukiyaki because Luffy thought that it made him look more like a samurai, and to be fair, he wasn't wrong. And although Luffy did wield it, he didn't actually use it. He just held it whilst continuing to punch people. And Sukiyaki said that it was disrespectful to so much as touch the Nidai Kitetsu without great reverence. And it can be argued that this sword led Luffy to a pretty horrible fate, as it was still with him right up until his first brutal defeat at the hands of Kaido. But at least the Nidai Kitetsu spared Luffy's life, which should be considered a kindness. And up next is the much more agreeable Ame no Habakiri, one of Kozuki Oden's dual blades, which carries the meaning feathery cutter of heaven, a reference to Japanese mythology, specifically the blade that Susanoo used to slay the legendary Yamato no Orochi, which funnily enough, the Ame no Habakiri was one of the only swords on all of Wano that didn't get its turn to slice a head off Kurozumi Orochi, who had eaten the Yamato no Orochi devil fruit. However, this was one of the two swords that Kozuki Oden used to scar Kaido, a feat that was once thought impossible both before and even after Oden did it, because it was an awfully long time before someone managed to do it again. After Oden's passing, the Ame no Habakiri was inherited by Momonosuke, who is still training to be capable of wielding it properly, and this sword is said to be capable of slicing through the very heavens themselves. All around, it has a very heavenly vibe, quite pleasant, and that's because it was designed to be the counterpart to our next most powerful blade, Enma, named directly after the king of the underworld in Buddhist mythology, and Enma is said to be capable of cutting through to the very bottom of hell. It was crafted by Shimotsuki Kozaburo, who eventually left Wano to settle Zoro's village in East Blue, and up until Kozuki Oden, there wasn't a single person capable of using Enma. I have Enma, it's the heaviest of all of the swords I own. But with both Enma and the Ami no Habakiri, Kozuki Oden's range allowed him to slice the very top of the heavens and the very bottom of hell. Effectively, everything, which is why he is one of, and arguably even the greatest swordsman in history. However, it would ultimately be Zoro who would inherit the legacy of Enma, and doing so showed Enma as one of the most treacherous blades to date. One that puts its wielders through merciless life or death tests, and can drain lower class swordsmen of all of their haki, leaving them a lifeless husk almost instantaneously. Enma is by far the most difficult sword to wield in the series that we know of so far. Because the Kitetsu, yeah, they're said to curse you with a horrible fate, eventually. But Enma will eviscerate you from this world just by touching it if you are not worthy to hold it, maybe even if you are. Because Kozuki Oden and Zoro are literally the only two people this is heavy. I'm gonna keep that in there. Because I am not worthy of Enma. Point proven. Because Kozuki Oden and Zoro are literally the only two people in history to have successfully cut something using Enma. It's also one of the few blades we know of that is capable of going directly up against swords in the supreme grade category and genuinely hold its own. It's also been suggested that Enma has the potential to increase its rank as a sword to move up to that supreme grade. However, it requires the user turning Enma into a black blade. A great example of which is Shusui, the national treasure of Wano and the sword that was used by the legendary samurai Ryuma, a sword which made its way into the greater world after Gekko Moria stole Ryuma's corpse. I have Shusui as well. Black blades are known as the strongest and most durable swords on the planet. Thwack. That was unimpressive. You disappoint me, Shusui. But there is almost nothing, if anything, that can cut a black blade. And we're not entirely certain how they're created, but it seems likely that the black coating is a method of haki imbuement, a skill that only the greatest of swordsmen in history are capable of, like Ryuma. Shusui has been noted as being very heavy and a particularly bloodthirsty sword, often causing far too much destruction, leaving most swordsmen incapable of using it to any decent degree, and it took Zoro 2 years of training with Mihawk to really get comfortable with Shusui. Although it was noted that after this period, Shusui became Zoro's favored blade to use. Unfortunate because he had to return it to its resting place during Wano, but Zoro did get Enma in exchange, and now has the chance to cement his legacy by crafting a black blade of his own. But he is also in possession of the Wado Ichimonji, which was also made by Shimotsuki Kozaburo, then passed down to Koshiro, then Kuina, and of course now Zoro after Kuina's unfortunate incident with Down D stairs. So Wado is a very special sword. Its name is quite unique. It means straight line through the path of harmony. That's not straight. That's not straight. Sword in general isn't very straight. And while the Wado has been very quiet compared to its contemporaries, it has been theorized that the Wado is actually responsible for Zoro's horrible sense of direction, because wherever he is, Wado is always guiding him to the path of harmony. Harmony being an option that Zoro almost never takes. Hence why he gets along so well with all the cursed swords. But the Wado Ichimonji is also one of the few swords that have been valued in the One Piece world, coming out with a price tag of 10 million berries, which I personally think might be an underestimation for a sword that withstood a killing blow from Mihawk's Yoru, which we'll look into in a bit. But before we get into the top 5 most powerful swords in One Piece, there are still some honorable mentions. Trafalgar Law's sword Kikoku is also a confirmed cursed blade. However, we know next to nothing about its capabilities as an actual sword, because Law always uses it in conjunction with his devil fruit abilities. Surprisingly, it's also not a graded sword at all. It doesn't exist on the Meito scale, at least not that we know of at the time of this recording. And the same goes for Shanks' sword Griffin, which if I had to guess was almost certainly a member of the Meito, because it has been used against a supreme grade blade in the past to equal results. And it should also be said that Shanks' probable father relative Man-Figurant Garling also has a Griffin-like sword. Another one that I wouldn't count out is Shiryu's Ryu, meaning Thunderstorm. It's a very long Nodachi that measures an insane 3 meters in length, and despite its size, it's intended for extremely delicate and precise use. Also, I feel like I'd be remiss not to mention Napoleon, Big Mom's sword homie, who outside of this ranking system, would probably be considered one of, if not the single most powerful sword in the series, but it's a bit unfair because most of that is due to being a homie and not the actual craftsmanship behind Napoleon's shell. But with those out of the way, here are the top 5 currently confirmed most powerful swords in One Piece. The first of which is the Yakuza Kassen, used by Marine Admiral Fujitora. So the naming of this one is a bit odd. It means Yakuza firing line, and that's a reference to the 1972 Shin Yakuza Heitai Kassen film, which starred Shintaro Katsu, the real-life model for Fujitora's character design. Its style is a Shikomizue, and its most distinguishing feature is that it has no guard. The reason being that Shikomizue were often used as concealed weapons designed for stealth and surprise. The idea being that the user of this blade isn't anticipating an extended battle, and removing the guard also makes it much lighter and faster. And being one of only 12 supreme grade swords in the world, the Yakuza Kassen is a source of pride and joy for its origins of Wano, having been crafted by Fugetsu Kisaburo, ancestor of Fugetsu Omusubi, who was one of the 3 samurai that got trapped in a cave with Yamato. However, it is not the ultimate source of Wano pride. That honor would likely go to the Shodai Kitetsu, the original member of the Kitetsu set made by Kitetsu himself, and the sword that both the Nidai and Sandai Kitetsu were attempting to copy. Historically speaking, this is the oldest known sword on this list. It's difficult to put an exact date on it, but we're looking at an age somewhere close to a millennia. In terms of power, it dwarfs the 2 Kitetsus that came after it, and it does so physically as well. It's often difficult to see in the series due to perspective, but the Shodai Kitetsu is a very big boy, and it's currently wielded by Saint Ethan Baron Venus Jiro, one of the 5 Elder Stars and highest authorities on this planet. As with the other 2, the Shodai Kitetsu is cursed. It's very cursed. However, Ethan himself has essentially made a deal with the devil already, so an extra curse, what does that really mean to him? The Shodai Kitetsu couldn't kill him if it wanted to. Now, for a sword that means a lot to a certain someone, we have reached the pinnacle of sharp metal with Ace, the blade used by the former Pirate King Goldie Roger, and a sword that Roger loved so much that he even went so far as to name his son after it. This is also the sword that has demonstrated the most powerful blade attack we've seen to date, which is known as Divine Departure, whereby Roger infused an absurd amount of his Conqueror's Haki into a horizontal slash, although it should be noted that this attack has since been replicated by Shanks using Griffin to great effect as well. Roger used Ace for almost 3 decades. It was the key weapon of choice for the former Pirate King, and Oda has drawn this magnificent specimen personified as well, and if you're curious, personified Ace is very coyly saying Divine Departure. Ace is also one of the only Meito swords in the series that was not modeled after a Japanese template. Instead, Ace is a very classic pirate cutlass. Meanwhile, Whitebeard's Murakumogiri isn't even a sword, really. However, it is recognized as a supreme grade blade, the only one we currently know of that isn't a sword. Instead, it's Naginata, and its name means Gathering Clouds Cutter. This is potentially a reference to the very first time it was used in the series, which was when Whitebeard clashed with Shanks, resulting in the sky splitting above them. And due to it being very much not a sword, opponents of Whitebeard often found it very difficult to fight against, because they were used to fighting against more traditional sharp metal. And after at least 3 decades of use at the highest levels, even when Whitebeard's body was crumbling from age and wounds, Murakumogiri was pristine and spotless until the very end. It's currently been retired and rests at Whitebeard's grave, and at a glance, you would never know that it had ever been used in battle at all. It is just that well made. So much so that there is only one blade on this planet that could possibly top it. And that would of course be Yoru, the favored weapon of the current world's greatest swordsman Drakeo Mihawk. This colossal specimen, likely based on a Kriegmesser, is over 2 meters in length and actually taller than Mihawk himself. As you may have noticed, Yoru is also a black blade, the only confirmed black blade in the series to be on the supreme grade level, meaning that this sword has been completely maxed out, and until further notice, it is without doubt the most elite blade in the entire One Piece world.